these long-term effects. It's really about getting people hooked on them so that they become consumers of the drugs for the rest of their lives and spend a ton of money. They don't even know the long-term side effects of a lot of these drugs. I would just counsel people, it's not like, I'm just saying in this unilateral way, no, they're just bad. No, they can be really helpful, but to use them with real caution, because they can incredibly get in the way of connecting with our deeper awakening. They can create like this anesthesia in the psyche where we become numb to our feelings, and then we're not really able to deal with the deeper emotional process that's informing our being upset.
In Chapter 8, titled Evil, you write about some of your readers who objected to the use of the word evil. The word triggered something inside them which made them feel uncomfortable. You ask, is there something being revealed to us because it's a trigger, and do we need the homeopathic dose? Can you talk about that in context of the current criticism within classroom environments and that prevent professors to teach certain topics because of trigger words such as rape?
Yeah, totally. Well, it makes me think. Like I had a dream one time, and in the dream I was lucid in the dream to whatever degree I was. So I was going up to my dream characters, who were just aspects of myself, and I was, in my excitement, was telling them, oh, hey, guess what? This is all a dream. We're dreaming. And one of them, I'll never forget this, he was like, could you use another word? I have like a charge around that word, and I just have bad associations around the word dream, and could you choose another word? So here I am, and I'm in a dream, and I'm realizing it's a dream, and I'm saying to other people it's a dream, and they're saying, oh, please don't use that word. And it's like a similar conundrum you find, and I talk about this in my latest book, that evil, there's no better word to describe the incredible, destruction that's being enacted. Like that word was coined with a particular meaning. And I totally understand that it's a trigger word, that word like that, somebody hears it and they immediately get triggered. And what typically people do is, oh, well, just if you don't use that word, then I won't be triggered, then I'll feel better. But I would like to offer to them, well, what in you is being touched in your process of being triggered? What about if you put your attention there and see it as an opportunity to inquire into the charge that just got activated by the mere mention of the word evil, as compared to like, oh, stop mentioning that word and then I won't be triggered. That just seems backwards and upside down. And so I think it's really important. It's a moral need of our species to find the right words for our experience. And it also brings up the fact that in mainstream culture, they can, it's easy for the powers that be to control our perceptions and our thinking by making these limitations on what we're allowed to talk about. Oh, we can't, that can't be part of the dialogue. Oh, we can't use that word. Oh, you can't think about that. Oh, you're not allowed to perceive in that way. And it's all part of the programming, the conditioning, the brainwashing, the hypnosis that we all go through. It's like we're being put under a spell. And the spell is of massive proportions. It's a collective spell, and the mainstream media is the major propaganda organ of the powers that be. So I just really feel strongly that it's super important for us to find the right word. And that's why even in my book, I talk about the importance of finding the word Watiko, that I'm not attached to that's the word we use. Every wisdom tradition has their own word for what the natives call Watiko. But it's important to find a word that has like a meaning to us. And, just one final thing, like in a fairy tale or a myth, if there's like a demon, they always point at that once you find the demon's name, and it can't just be any name, it has to be the right name, the proper name. Once you find the right name of the demon, it takes away its power. And the same way, we have this need to be able to like find the language and find the words. And how do you make a word? You spell it, to find the words that actually create the counterspell. That's why the title of my book is Dispelling the Curse of Evil. And so it's super important for us to be able to speak the right word for what our experience is.
That was part of an interview with past guest Paul Levy, author of Dispelling Watiko, Breaking the Curse of Evil. Paul says encoded in the very same affliction that will destroy us from the inside out is a process that can empower and wake us up. But if you can't recognize that, it hides itself from being seen. It will continue to operate in sinister ways. Past guest, Professor Eric Larson, who gave me his copy of Dispelling Wetiko, wrote a powerful essay on this book. The shadow, or Wetiko, doesn't have power on its own. It operates through the unconscious, in the psychic blind spot, and manifesting as projections. Paul's research found that the Wetiko virus won't mutate. It forces us to mutate. Paul Levy is also the author of The Madness of George W. Bush, a reflection of our collective psychosis, and also Awakened by Darkness, When Evil Becomes Your Father. Boundaries and shadow work also scale up and apply to businesses, corporations, or countries. Remember what Dr. Joe Slate said about location being irrelevant. In physics, it's called the non-local field. There's no separation anywhere. The third-dimensional laws of space and time are transcended. They don't hold. Everything is connected with everything else. Paul Levy says, when we think, that bad guy, that terrorist, etc., they're evil, we've fallen under the spell of Wetiko. What Wetiko feeds off of, not only fear, but polarization. If we think that someone is evil, that's the way the Wetiko is hiding within our perception. When you see those non-local fields, then you begin to see the dreamlike nature of reality. You realize we don't exist in isolation. We're interdependent with each other. We all exist in this web, this reciprocal interconnection. When you see that, that's the snap out of the separate self. The expression out of the realization is compassion. Compassion is the Wetiko dissolver. Healthy human boundaries, opening the door for win-win deals. High character, making decisions out of courage. And an awareness of the human shadow, or Wetiko, transforming the darkness into gold, are all connected and forming part of the formula in maintaining the human energy system. That's going to do it for In Other News. I'm Jeff Brady. Visit inothernewsradio.com for archives and more information about the guests.
Global Community Radio Channel 1, KAKU-LP Kahilui, KBOG-LP Bandon, KFZR-LP Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP Monroe, KLQS-LP Agua Dulce, KPDO Pescadero, Sunflower State Radio Extra Marysville, WLRI-LP Gap, WMUU-LP Madison, WRAQ-LP Angelica, WXDR-LP New Orleans, WXIR-LP Rochester.
Next on What's the Frequency, Kenneth?
I'm Mike Buckley from APL's Office of Communications and Public Affairs. And this morning, NASA's New Horizons spacecraft at 12:33 a.m. flew by a Kuiper Belt object nicknamed Ultima Thule, the farthest flyby in history.
I'm Paul Fisher.
This morning, at about 10:30, the spacecraft phoned home, sending a signal back to mission operations here at APL to let us know that it was healthy and it collected all the data we asked at Ultima Thule.
I don't know about all of you, but I'm really liking this 2019 thing so far. We're here to tell you that last night, overnight, the United States spacecraft New Horizons conducted the farthest exploration in the history of humankind and did so spectacularly. Thousands of operations on board the spacecraft had to work correctly in order for us to be able to tell you this, and now we know that it all did.
And I just wanted to give you a little feeling about what it was like to be in the Mission Ops Center. The first person to report was the RF communications lead, and we kept our eyes on him, and as soon as he started smiling, we knew things were going well. And it took a while for him to report, but then we go to the C&DH lead, and he reported that the solid-state recorder had the right amount of data he expected. We also went to the propulsion lead. He said the tank pressures look good. And we just went around the subsystems, the power, everybody reporting green status, and it was just a thrill.
So these are still very low-resolution images, but as we speak, right now, signals from the spacecraft are coming back across the solar system at the speed of light. They're currently about halfway back to Earth. And overnight tonight, the science team will be analyzing the first high-resolution images, which we'll be able to show you
So what
tomorrow.
can we tell you from this image?
Well, first, we have a better handle on the size of Ultima. It's about 35 by 15 kilometers, and you can see a scale bar in miles there. Secondly, you see its irregular shape. And there are two possibilities here. One possibility is that it's bilobate, with the upper lobe being smaller than the lower lobe, so they would be asymmetric. Or it may be that these are two things that are actually in orbit. Well, you know, we had an event in the summer of 2017 in which we painted out the silhouette of Ultima as it crossed in front of the star that we were able to observe from Argentina. And that gave us a pretty solid indication that the shape was elongated and probably something like bilobate, very much like this. Al, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing, and this is nothing against Marcia. In fact, most of the small bodies in the solar system are highly elongated. And so we were expecting that, because they just don't have enough mass to force themselves into an almost perfect sphere, they kind of come together from the material, from which the solar system formed, into these clumpy things. And that's what you saw, for example, in the case of comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the target of the Rosetta mission. It was a bilobate object, and that's common among the cometary nuclei and among the asteroids. So, in fact, we were expecting
a similar feeling. Was it completely different? I know it was kind of pins and needles here in this audience.
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Yeah. It was a little bit different. And part of it had to do with the timing of it. If you remember at Pluto, we had the flyby actually occurred in the morning about 7 a.m. And then we had contact with the spacecraft in the evening about 9. And so we pretty much spent the whole day here. And so this one, we celebrated at night, a little after midnight. And then we went home and then came back early in the morning. And it was this feeling like, gosh, we already celebrated, but we really haven't gotten that signal back from the spacecraft. So, it's a little bit different feeling. I think I was probably a little bit more nervous this time. But again, we did it again, so it's fantastic.
Well, we're certainly prepared to provide additional funding for enhanced fencing, technology, drones, satellites, lighting, sensors, cell phone towers, and the things that the experts have clearly indicated would improve our border security. In addition to that, we certainly want to enhance the ability of our officials at the southwest border to conduct themselves in a humane fashion and to avoid the type of tragedies that occurred with Jacqueline and Felipe. That was unacceptable, un-American, and unconscionable, and we need to do better.
Opened with parts of the government closed. And the opening act of 2019 included a new acting defense secretary. An acting attorney general. An acting White House Chief of Staff. And the feeling of very real chaos at large. because the actors replacing the real things are all yes men. The real ones jumped or were pushed for standing up to Trump's impulses and ideas. But I guess we shouldn't be surprised. We knew Trump hires advisors and cabinet secretaries out of central casting. That is, they look the part. So it's only fitting the word acting is in the title of so many key officials now.
And $5 billion, given the context of what was sent over from the House. Plus other things, I think, is in the realm of possibility.
If a DACA for Wall Street didn't work in the past, what makes you think it might work now with the House now?
Well, it was never just DACA for the wall. It was a lot of moving parts. The diversity lottery was ended. We were arguing about how to transition to merit-based immigration. So the president did put a pathway to citizenship on the table for 1.8 million dreamers. But he also wanted to go to a merit-based immigration, and that was a bridge too far, no pun intended. I think we have a chance here to end 2018 or begin 2019 with a breakthrough on immigration. A $5 billion appropriation wisely spent would go a long way to securing our border. It's just not about physical barriers, it's about other things.
Willing to back off the term wall war, as Democrats want to talk about technology and other kinds of barriers. Is he prepared to say it doesn't have to be?
All I can tell you is that Democrats have voted for 700 miles of the Secure Fence Act that had double-layered fencing. Call that whatever you'd like. In the Gang of Eight bill, we had $42 billion for border security, including $9 billion for physical barriers. The wall has become a metaphor for border security.
Well, we are. We have no choice. We have to have border security, and a wall is part of border security. You know, I hear so much about the wall is old-fashioned. No, the wall is not old-fashioned. The wall is 100% foolproof. You look at a wheel. Well, I guess they'd say the wheel is old-fashioned, but it's been around for a long time. The wall is the only way to do it. And technology, nobody knows more about technology than me, but technology are just the bells and whistles on the wall. If you don't have the wall, you're going to have people coming in. And my Border Patrol people, they do a fantastic job. But, you know, they need the backup of the wall, and they're the ones that want it more than anybody, Pete.
everything's alright tonight. It was time to go. Tugs thrust and pulled our boat bulk away from the quay until our own 3 engines and 55,000 horsepower could take over.
As for acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, you may have heard the old audio that was recently unearthed, with Mulvaney calling Trump a terrible human being and heaping scorn on Trump's border wall.
1/6 of a mile long, 11 stories high.
But now, as acting White House Chief of Staff, Mulvaney's trying to spin Trump's border policy into some kind of coherence, whether it's the threat to shut down the border entirely, Trump's claim that most federal workers are Democrats, and yet in another Trump claim that most of these Democratic federal workers who were sent home for the duration support Trump's border wall. And oh yeah, it's all Nancy Pelosi's fault. Because that worked so well for Trump in the midterms, when he ran against Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats picked up 40 seats and the majority in the House.
I think is happening. This all comes down to Mrs. Pelosi's speakership. I think left to his own devices that Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats probably would cut a deal, but they're protecting Mrs. Pelosi. She does not have the votes, and if she cuts a deal with the president of any sort before her election on January 3rd, she's at risk of losing her speakership. So we're in this for the long haul. A couple other things I want to point out with my OMB hat on. A lot of folks reported that people are working without pay. Okay, not true. Paychecks actually go out today. We're in the middle of a government shutdown. Folks who are furloughed, however, would need legislation in order to pay them for the time that they were furloughed. So that's how that system works. But the paychecks do go out today.
Then she set off for the open sea in New York.
And the folks who are working today will get paid. They're due to be paid for the work today on the 11th.
As she sailed away, our builders had no doubt that this was the start of a great career.
And if the government opens up before that, they'll be paid on the 11th. If not, they won't be paid until after the government opens. So,
why does the president believe that those not getting paid are Democrats?
Now, I think, he and I talked about last night. I think he was trying to point out a political reality, which is, let's face it, Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland, D.C. are heavily Democrat areas, okay? Many of the government workers live in these heavily Democrat areas. Virginia has 2 Democrat senators. Maryland has 2 Democrat senators. So why? Which is why he's in there. It's why. I'm going to ask. Okay, I will answer your question if you let me answer hers first. That's why he's here. He's not just here working for Republicans. He's here working for everybody. What he can't understand is the folks who are from heavily Democrat areas, who are around this area, are home and not talking to him. There's not a single Democrat talking to the President of the United States about this deal. Now, your question and yours, and I'll go.
So, sir, why then does he believe most federal workers support him shutting down the government?
I think he believes that a lot of people really do believe in border security. I've got a lot of messages from my friends saying, look, I'm a Democrat, but you're right about border security. Look at what's happening in California. Those stories happen too often. Border security is absolutely critical.
Speaking of acting cabinet members, actual Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen has been on the way out for as long as I can remember. She took a trip to the border the other day, now that 2 migrant children have died under her watch while in U.S. custody.
Obviously, those deaths are tragic. Certainly, anytime kids die, it's terrible.
How you find it sad? Keep telling myself.
But as far as I know, there's no evidence that ICE did anything wrong here. They did bring the child to the hospital. The hospital examined him, gave him medication, told ICE what to do, and then when the child became sick again, they brought him to the hospital almost immediately. So I think anytime you have conditions like this, where people are coming up, many of whom have bad health to begin with, they're living in terrible conditions.
Thinking of me differently, I'm thinking of myself. I'm starting to
They come up in a caravan or whatever, that this could happen. Listen, I know in New York City, in housing projects, you hear of kids dying. Unfortunately, people living in those conditions, that can happen. And I do applaud the Secretary for going there, though, to see if there's anything more that can be done. But I think it's wrong to be piling on here and somehow blaming ICE. I mean, they've had hundreds of thousands of people that they've had custody of over the years. And I think these are the only 2 children that have died, certainly in recent memory. So considering all of that and considering what does happen in housing projects across the country, I think ICE has an excellent record.
I'm aware I've begun to believe too much.
And I'd be very reluctant to be doing any piling on here right now.
We certainly want to enhance the ability of our officials at the southwest border to conduct themselves in a humane fashion and to avoid the type of tragedies that occurred with Jacqueline and Felipe. That was unacceptable, un-American, and unconscionable, and we need to do better.
I'm this way for a reason. You're thinking of me differently. I'm thinking of myself. Starting to stop as we speak. I'm starting to lose. I'm falling asleep and I'm sorry again.
Even now, with the start of the 116th Congress, there's still no clarity about the 9th Congressional District seat from North Carolina. Long story short, the Republican in the race hired an absentee ballot specialist, whatever that is. Who allegedly went to people's houses and collected absentee ballots, allegedly throwing out ballots filled out for the Democrat and allegedly filling out blank absentee ballots for the Republican. The election board dissolved without certifying a winner. An incoming House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, said he would not seat the Republican until the matter is investigated and sorted out. For his part, Republican candidate Mark Harris said he'd be willing to face off with the Democrat Dan McCready again. McCready was having none of that.
I'm Mark Harris. By now, you've probably seen news reports about alleged irregularities in the recent election. I wanted to personally let you know that my campaign and I are cooperating fully with the State Board of Elections investigation, and we will continue to do so. I trust the process that's underway, just as I've always trusted the decisions of the voters. I trust that this investigation will be full and complete, examining any alleged irregularities that could have benefited either party.
And I think it is amazing that my opponent, Mark Harris, went out and hired a convicted felon who was under investigation for absentee ballot fraud to do his absentee ballot program. Inconsequential love. And apparently he got what he paid for, because Mark Harris didn't just hire this felon, he actually recommended his services to others.
The integrity of our electoral process is the heart of our democracy, and we must protect it. And although I was absolutely unaware of any wrongdoing, that will not prevent me from cooperating with this
needs to come clean, Rachel. It is it's unacceptable to the people in North Carolina who have had their voices taken from them. Your vote is your voice. It is our most sacred right as Americans, is our right to vote. But I started my career in the Marine Corps, where I served overseas, and could never have imagined that I would come back home to North Carolina only to see our very democracy, our very right to vote, under attack here in North Carolina by criminals. And politicians.
I'm hopeful that this process will ultimately result in the certification of my election to Congress before the next House session begins. However, if this investigation finds proof of illegal activity on either side to such a level that it could have changed the outcome of the election, then I would wholeheartedly support a new election to ensure all voters have confidence in the results. As we move toward resolution, I look forward to participating in a transparent, factual, and fair process.
Completely silent since this whole thing happened. And I call on him to end the silence. I call on him to tell the American people, to tell folks in North Carolina exactly what he knew and when he knew it.
Hello, I'm Dan Rather, and you're listening to What's the Frequency, Kenneth? With musical host Paul Fisher in New York City.
As he's done with so many other sudden policy announcements, Trump keeps giving different reasons for the abrupt pullout of U.S. troops from Syria. So one day it's that ISIS is defeated, or that U.S. forces in Iraq can handle any flare-ups in Syria. Or that we're done being quote-unquote suckers. Whatever.
What effect do your decision in Syria to pull up the 2,000 troops have here in Iraq?
Well, we can do things from Iraq that we can take over some of the slack, but as you know, we've knocked out about 99% of the caliphate. It's time to bring them back. I told the generals about a year and a half ago, I said, let's get out of Syria. And they said, sir, can we have some more time? I said, yep. You got another 6 months. Let's get out of Syria. I've said it for a long time. And other places too I was talking about, but let's talk about Syria. I said, let's get out of Syria. Let's bring our young people home. And they said, sir, could we have 6 more months? I said, yep, you got 6 more months. Let's go. And I gave him 6 months. Then I said, let's get out. And they said, sir, could we have 6 more months? I said, yep, you got 6 more months. And then they said again recently, could we have more time? I said, nope, you can't have any more time. We got enough time. We've knocked them out. We've knocked them silly. I will tell you that I had some very good talks with President Erdogan, who wants to knock them out also, and he'll do it. Others will do it too, because the United States cannot continue to be the policeman of the world. We don't want to do that. We want to protect our country. These people want to protect our country.
Out of Iraq as well?
No plans at all, no. In fact, we could use this as a base if we wanted to do something in Syria. I will say this, if you take ISIS, and if we see something happening with ISIS that we don't like, we can hit them so fast and so hard, they really won't know what the hell happened. It's time to get our soldiers out. It's time to get our young people out. And I've been signing plenty of letters, and I don't like sending those letters home to parents.
If I understand one of Trump's recent tweets about Syria correctly, it's okay that he abruptly announced the pullout of U.S. troops because Turkey and Saudi Arabia are going to pick up the slack in Syria. Really? Turkey, which is more interested in wiping out the U.S. allied Kurdish fighters in Syria than ISIS fighters in Syria. Saudis? Sure, they're doing such a great job for us in Yemen.
Let's take our time, waiting our mind, people behind, the road stretches wide, close by my side, let's kill some time, let's go for a drive.
Which brings me to in light of yet more reports of the Saudis making hundreds of room reservations at Trump's D.C. hotel after the election, doing it through a Saudi lobbyist, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't catch up on what two Republican senators said after they finally got a closed-door briefing from the CIA director. On what U.S. intelligence knows about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the murder of Washington Post column writer Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Remember, Trump says there's no way to know if the Crown Prince did or didn't have a hand in ordering it. And keeps talking up how much the Saudis are paying to buy U.S. weapons. Even though his figures are widely disputed. And even if you think arms sales are a reason to look the other way when it comes to murdering a journalist.
I went into the briefing believing it was virtually impossible for an operation like this to be carried out without the Crown Prince's knowledge. I left the briefing with high confidence that my initial assessment of the situation is correct.
I have zero question in my mind that the Crown Prince, MBS, ordered the killing, monitored the killing, knew exactly what was happening. Planned it in advance. If he was in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes, guilty.
I left the briefing being amazed by our CIA and intelligence community's capability and their analytical reasoning. The CIA, in my view, rose to the occasion in terms of informing the Congress about what happened on October the 2nd. What's happened since and what happened before. So I am very satisfied with the briefing. There's a desire by the intelligence community to limit the number of people briefed. After that,
the question is, what do we do about that? So far, it's unfortunate, but I think they feel like this is something that's coming past because the administration has not spoken to this in a way that it has spoken to it in a manner that really gives them immunity. And so what the message is to him and those around him is that you can go around killing journalists. Countries like the United States can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you killed a journalist.
Request was made. I understand now why they want to keep it more limited than before. So here's my takeaway. That Saudi Arabia is a strategic ally and the relationship is worth saving, but not at all cost. We'll do more damage to our standing in the world and our national security by ignoring MBS than dealing with him. MBS, the Crown Prince,
And
is
by
a
the way,
wrecking
they,
ball.
as you know, renditioned other people and tortured other people that have been their dissidents. So the message we've sent to them is one that will cause him to continue on the path that he's on.
I think he's complicit in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi to the highest level possible.
Tommy, dear.
I think the behavior before the Khashoggi murder was beyond disturbing.
I could never.
And I cannot see him being a reliable partner to the United States.
I can never be.
Saudi Arabia and MBS are two different entities.
I could never be myself when you're around.
Saudi government is going to be in the hands of this man. For a long time
and I'm
to come,
sure
I
other
find it very
actors
difficult.
in the region will take note of that. So somehow or another, it's unfortunate. And again, I'm continuing to urge the administration to themselves speak to this in the appropriate manner.
Kill me.
What do you want them to do?
This has got to be strongly condemned by the administration, strongly condemned, and then there's got to be a price to pay for what has happened.
Forget me.
I know that they have to have exactly the same intelligence that we have, and there's
to be able to do business, because I think he's crazy. I think he is dangerous, and he has put the relationship at risk. No one has fought for this relationship harder than myself and Senator McCain. Senator McCain and I went on the floor stopping lawsuits against the kingdom for complicity in 9/11 because we did not believe the royal family was involved in the planning and execution of the 9/11 attacks.
Nightmares.
If John McCain were alive, I believe he would be standing with me today, leading the charge to come down like a ton of bricks on the Crown Prince for what he's done to the relationship. The way he's destabilized the region.
No way that anybody with a straight face could say there's any question about what has happened. So What are you prepared to do? So it's always, as you know, far more difficult to do something legislatively. I would prefer that we speak to the killing of the journalist.
Tick-tock, tick of the clock.
There are others that would prefer to speak to the killing of the journalist and to Yemen.
Enemy. Enemy. You're around.
So when you start moving down that path on a bill that addresses the War Powers Act, which is in itself complicated.
I will try to work my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to send a statement before the end of this Congress that, in fact, the Crown Prince was complicit in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi, that during his tenure as Crown Prince, he's put the region in chaos and has undercut the relationship, and I cannot support arms sales to Saudi Arabia as long as he's going to be in charge of this country.
I would like to actually pass something that became law. Others would like just to send a message. So you take all of those together.
Gravity will win. I'll just keep on falling.
Be much better if the commander-in-chief would stand up and say to the world,
I'm losing all my sense. You're pulling me back in.
we don't condone the killing, the ordering, and the killing and dismemberment of journalists. We don't condone that. And therefore, we're going to take these steps. That doesn't appear to happen.
The war in Yemen has gotten out of control. The brutality of this murder is beyond my sharing it with you. It was one of the most brutal acts one could imagine, and it says a lot about him as a person. And everybody is watching us.
I hope it hasn't happened yet. I hope it happens in the next couple of days. If it doesn't, we've got to figure out a way to address it.
Woke 1,000 times, tasting bitter morning.
And that makes it much more difficult.
Are you concerned the country's economic interests more important than what you said?
First of all, the amount of equipment they're buying is not anywhere near the number that has been laid out. So the economic piece of this is it's not even close. To the numbers that have been laid out. Look, Saudi Arabia does what it does with oil and with Iran. They do what's in their best interest, okay? So, as you know, you saw recently where they're negotiating to curtail the amount of oil production because prices are where they are. So to think that they do what they're doing with oil, or they do what they do with Iran because of us.
There are people who are raising their voice in dissent throughout the region and the world. They look to America for a helping hand. There are other people in the region who will see this as a green light if we look the other way. have relationships with many countries throughout the world. If they believe the relationship is more important than our values, then they're going to get the wrong message and the world becomes a more dangerous place.
It's in their own interest to do what they do in both cases.
Senator, are you planning to be willfully blind to, I'm sorry, you can't say with a straight face that
you cannot say with a straight face.
So how do you square what Mike Pompeo said standing at these microphones last week, that there's no direct evidence of this, and how do you square the two briefings you
Let me just put it this way.
Trying to get you safe, and you fail.
If the Crown Prince went in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes.
Of murder?
Yes.
Secretary Pompeo stood where you're standing right now last week and said he had seen no direct evidence of the prince's involvement.
I think Secretary Pompeo and Mattis are following the lead of the president. There's not a smoking gun, there's a smoking saw. You have to be willfully blind not to come to the conclusion that this was orchestrated and organized by people under the command of MBS.
Step back and take a look at what has changed.
And that he was intricately involved in the demise of Mr. Khashoggi. Open source reports show that he had been focusing on Mr. Khashoggi for a very long time. It is zero chance, that this happened in such an organized fashion without the Crown Prince. As do Pompeo and Mattis. I have great respect for them. I would imagine if they were in a Democratic administration, I would be all over them for being in the pocket of Saudi Arabia. But since I have such respect for them, I'm going to assume that they're being good soldiers. And when they look at the analysis, they're being technical in their statement. But they're not giving the assessment that I think the Senate will have. I would really question somebody's judgment if they couldn't figure this out. It is there to be figured out. Please let me finish.
Sunrise.
And I think the reason they don't draw the conclusion that he's complicit.
Give way to sirens. I hear the voices. Give way to silence. It looks like fire, but it's just sunshine. Waters are rising, forests are burning. Hearts always hurt more while they are learning. Say
because the administration doesn't want to go down that road, not because there's not evidence to suggest he's complicit.
From out of the sirens might come the bird song. Out of the silence might come the love song. After the love song might come the sunrise. After the sunrise might come the silence.
Days later, the lame duck Senate voted to approve two resolutions, one opposing the U.S.-backed Saudi war with Yemen, the other condemning the Saudi crown prince for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. And in one of his final acts as House Speaker, lame duck Paul Ryan blocked the House from voting to do what the Senate did.
It's not an SOS that I take a few SSRIs. I'm doing alright. I'm always just fine.
And what's the frequency, Kenneth? 2019. It just has to be better. It just has to. For the complete playlist of music and sound bites on the program, you can go to the program's Facebook page. What's the frequency? Paul. Here's the music that I played. Started off with Kaleidoscope Eyes by Liz Cooper and the Stampede. Blinded by the LEDs by Lindstrom. Planet B featuring Nick Zinner did Never Let Me Down Again. We heard White Star Liner by Public Service Broadcasting. The saxophones did Singing Desperately. Silhouettes by American Football. Gorilla Toss did Come Up With Me. Sunday Driver by the Raconteurs. Premiere Detours by Cosmic Analog Ensemble. We heard Let's Not Exist by Gabi. House of Dolls by Chromatics. 07 did Mono. We heard Claudion by Helena DeLand. Birdsong by Regina Spektor. And in the background now, that's Breathe by Estacota. And you've been listening to What's the Frequency, Kenneth? I'm Paul Fisher.
Global Community Radio, Channel 1, KAKU-LP, Kahilui, KBOG-LP, Bandon, KFZR-LP, Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP, Monroe, KLQS-LP, Agua Dulce, KPDO, Pescadero, Sunflower State Radio Extra, Marysville, WLRI-LP, Gap, WMUU-LP, Madison, WRAQ-LP, Angelica, WXDR-LP New Orleans, WXIR-LP Rochester.
This is VOA News. I'm Tommy McNeil. Senior Trump administration officials met Saturday with Democratic congressional staffers, but they failed to break a deadlock over a proposed border wall and end a 2-week-old partial government shutdown. President Trump said on Twitter that Vice President Mike Pence had briefed him on the meeting and that not much headway had been made. A second meeting is scheduled for Sunday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in a statement released Saturday that the senseless uncertainty and chaos of the Trump shutdown must end now. Her statement said next week Democrats would begin passing individual appropriations bills to reopen all government agencies, starting with the appropriations bill that covers the Department of Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service, so Americans can get their tax refunds on time. President Trump is demanding $5.6 billion to build a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico. Congressional Democrats have said they will not provide money for the wall, calling it foolish and wasteful. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren is testing the waters in Iowa for a possible presidential bid, with speaking engagements and listening tours through the all-important state for 2020 candidates. AP correspondent Julie Walker.
Senator Warren talked about her plans for the country, which include investing in education, healthcare, and housing.
We should dream big, fight hard, and take back our country.
But the first audience question was about Warren's DNA test and President Trump.
I can't stop Donald Trump from what he's going to do.
Then she pivoted back to her message.
What 2020 is going to be about is not about my family. It's about the tens of millions of families across this country who just want a level playing field.
Senator Warren's swing through Iowa continues through the weekend. I'm Julie Walker.
And this is VOA News. The head of Congo's election commission says that plans to announce the winner of the country's presidential election cannot move forward as scheduled on Sunday. Corneille Nangaa said that the commission has received less than half of the vote tally sheets as of Saturday. He said it was not clear when the results will be ready to be announced. An electoral commission spokesman said the commission would hold a meeting Sunday to decide when results will be announced. The delay is the latest in a series of setbacks in the poll to pick a successor to the president who has ruled the country since his father was assassinated in 2001. The December 30th vote could mark the DRC's first democratic transition of power since independence from Belgium in 1960. French security forces fired tear gas and flashbang ammunition at protesters during a march through picturesque central Paris Saturday, as several thousand supporters of the Yellow Vest movement kept up pressure on President Emmanuel Macron with the first action of 2019. Smoke and tear gas wafted above a museum and the gold dome of the French Academy as riot police moved front and center when protesters deviated from an officially approved path. The massive demonstrations began on November 17th due to mounting dissatisfaction about fuel tax hikes and the high cost of living, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron's leadership. Since then, Macron has abandoned the fuel tax plan, announced extra cash for minimum wage workers, and promised tax cuts for struggling pensioners in an attempt to halt the ongoing protest. A top admiral at the Pentagon, Rear Admiral Kevin Sweeney, has resigned just days after his former boss, former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, left the Defense Department. In a statement Saturday, Sweeney, the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, said it was an honor to serve again alongside the men and women of the Department of Defense. Former Secretary James Mattis, for whom Sweeney served, announced his resignation in December and left his post earlier this month. The United Nations envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, arrived in the capital Saturday to hold talks with government and rebel leaders as international efforts aimed at ending the country's civil war continues. Griffiths was to meet with leaders of the Iran-aligned Houthi rebels, then go to the Saudi Arabia consulate to consult with the Yemeni president. Meanwhile, security officials say Yemen's Shiite rebels and government forces are shelling one another in areas south of Hudaydah, straining an already shaky ceasefire in the Red Sea port city. I'm Tommy McNeil, VOA News.
This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, Paul Barclay with you on RN, on the ABC Listen app, or wherever you get your podcasts. On this Big Ideas, feisty feminist and author Clementine Ford on how men and masculinity need to change and why it won't be easy.
What men need to realise is that it's not enough to just want to be a part of making things different. It actually requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of discomfort. It's not a very nice experience to be confronted with all of the ways that you benefit in the world and to be confronted with all the things that you have to do in order to change that.
It's difficult to think of a time when the behaviour of men has come under greater scrutiny than today. The hashtag #MeToo movement continues to highlight sexual harassment and assault. There's widespread condemnation of violence against women, though a woman is still killed every week in Australia due to domestic violence. And overall, there's little tolerance for disrespectful, sexist, or misogynistic displays by men. But writer and feminist Clementine Ford believes there's a long, long way to go. About 2 years ago, she gave birth to a baby boy, a life-altering event that helped shape her new book, Boys Will Be Boys, an examination of toxic masculinity and patriarchal power. Clementine Ford and I spoke about her book at the Greek Club in Brisbane. She'd recently returned from America, where all the talk was about the accusations of sexual misconduct against Brett Kavanaugh, who's since been sworn in as a US Supreme Court Justice. Clementine Ford begins this conversation with her impressions of the Kavanaugh controversy and how she believes it's emblematic of a boys will be boys attitude. A warning before we begin that parts of this discussion touch on issues of sexual assault and rape and might not be appropriate for children.
Well, you know, there was a group of 5 Republican women who were said to be random, but it turned out that they'd all previously run, in elections. 5 Republican women who came out in defence of Kavanaugh and said, very varying degrees of this is not really that big a deal. And one of them, in fact, said, what boy hasn't done this? I mean, that's a really scary prospect that some people think that what boy hasn't held a girl down and tried to remove her clothes? This is just what boys do. And actually that leads to the really important point that this is a room full of feminists here, and so everyone here has been accused at some point of hating men and thinking all men are rapists, because of course if you believe in a world that works towards gender equality and values the dignity and autonomy of all human beings, then it means of course that you want to destroy one gender. But there's nothing that paints all men as rapists more than using the phrase boys will be boys to excuse sexual violence, or using victim-blaming terminology like, well, what was she wearing? How much was she drinking? Well, she had a beer that night at the party, or, why did she go into a room with him, or what did she expect? All of that language is what says that men are just rapists looking for an opportunity. It's not feminists who believe that. Feminists are the ones who say we understand and recognise that men can be and are better than that, and that we have an obligation to hold them to that standard. It's feminists who choose to remain partnered with men or mothers to boys because we recognise the humanity of men. And I feel like that's one of the most upsetting and frustrating accusations that we have to deal with, because if we were truly sensible and if we truly put ourselves first, we would have nothing to do with men at all. But the fact that we continue to work alongside them and continue to invest in the humanity that we know exists in men and that we value in men is testament to how different our philosophy of men's true natures is to everyone who wants to hold up the mainstream.
Let's talk about this term toxic masculinity. It's a term that's used a lot in the States as well as in Australia, and there are several people, including those who are sympathetic, I think, to your arguments, who find the term a little inflammatory and unhelpful. I think they suggest that maybe it implies all masculinity or all men are toxic, and therefore may hinder the conversation that you're trying to create with the book. What do you mean when you use the term toxic masculinity?
You're right. It's a mistake that people make, thinking that when you say toxic masculinity, that what you're saying is all masculinity is toxic. But that's not it. If you meant that, you would just say masculinity. Toxic masculinity just refers to the elements of masculinity that are weaponized underneath the patriarchy, that are taken by a patriarchy and imbued with really damaging ideas, not just damaging to the women who invariably end up more significantly harmed by them, but also to the men who are forced to conform to what it is that masculinity in this world demands of them. It is a form of toxic masculinity, of course, to say boys will be boys when excusing a sexual assault. But it's also a form of toxic masculinity to say to a little boy, man up. Boys don't cry. To try and knock the sensitivity out of a boy, because if he wants to grow up to be a quote-unquote real man, he shouldn't display these kinds of feelings. He shouldn't wear pink. He shouldn't want butterflies painted on his cheeks. He shouldn't have intimate relationships that are platonic with other men unless they clarify that there's nothing sexual going on between them. It's, again, a form of toxic masculinity to suggest that the only way that a heterosexual man can express his true emotions is if he does it with the woman that he's sleeping with, because beyond that kind of threatens the idea of stoic masculinity and threatens what it is conceived of in the minds of people to be a real man. All of those things lead not just to toxic ideas, but to toxic behaviours and practices. And that's the distinction.
So this book continues a trajectory of your writing, obviously, over the years. But I'm curious, would you have written Boys Will Be Boys if you hadn't given birth to a young son and contemplated what lay ahead?
I would have done, because it's the natural companion text to Fight Like a Girl. Fight Like a Girl was an exploration of how patriarchy affects girls and women, using my own personal stories as anchor points throughout the book. But I think what having a son, and I would like to just acknowledge, of course, that gender is a spectrum, and it may not be that he turns out to be a son, but that's the premise that we're working with right now. And this book is an all gender inclusive text. But I think that having a son and thinking from a more emotional place about how this individual person that I love more than anyone else in the whole world will be shaped by the world around him, directed the focus in some of the more personal ways that you found in Fight Like a Girl.
There's a lovely letter to your son that forms the final chapter of the book, where you express your hopes and desires for him growing up as a man, and as you say, whatever gender he does end up growing up as in Australia, but growing up like that in our culture, hoping he can resist and reject the reductive stereotypes that you write of in the book. Do you find it a daunting prospect, raising a boy in the culture that you've been so critical of in both of your last two books?
I do find it daunting, because there's only so much you can do in your own home to try and shape your children and to provide them with what you think are the right morals and ethical frameworks, and support as well for whoever it is that they may turn out to be. But once you release them into the world, we are all governed by subconscious bias, and you can't control the subconscious bias of the people he will be encountering when he goes to school, when he goes to his friends' houses to play. You know, so in that letter, I wrote to him as if he was reading it when he was an adult. And I say in one section the things that I want to teach him now and that I hope I'm successful at. And one of the things I say to him is that I really hope he doesn't lose the sensitivity and the kindness that I see in him now, and to not let the world break him, because the world has too many broken men. And also that don't be afraid of sharing your emotions with another man. To share an emotional space with another man doesn't make you somehow less of one. And I really want to impart that to him. I want him to know always that no matter what happens, you can't protect your children from everything, but no matter what happens in the outside world that he's dealing with, that his home will always be a really safe place for him to express himself freely. And one of the things that I find scary and deeply upsetting when I think about not just masculinity, but some of the things that I've uncovered in this book, is that not everyone, girls and boys and everyone else alike, can rely on their home being a safe place. Not just because there may be physical or sexual violence in that home, but because it may not be an emotionally safe place for someone to discover who they are.
But as you say, we're born into such a gendered world that once kids are released into it, they kind of self-gender, don't they? So in a sense, for your son to be the person that you would ideally like him to be, we need cultural change.
Absolutely. We need massive, widespread cultural change. And it's not just about initiatives that address sexism or sexist attitudes. The government has amazingly released quite a good campaign around domestic violence. And I say amazingly because government initiatives around men's violence against women have not always been particularly good or particularly reflective of the real deep issues. But this one has addressed the link between disrespectful language and sexist ideas and violence meted out against women later on. So that's great. I think, the problem is that it's not just about how we gender children once they're released into the world, as it were. It's how we gender children before they're even born. It's very common for people to feel like they need to know what sex a baby is before it's born. So, people who are pregnant will be asked, is it a boy or a girl? And look, I don't think that that's a question that is necessarily framed with ill intent. I think it's just we have this strong desire to categorize things. And if you can categorize an unborn child as a boy, then you can subconsciously start assuming how you will treat that baby before they're born. You can start buying clothes for them that reflect what it is our culture thinks is appropriate for boys to wear. Some of the things that I see available in terms of fashion for children are not just annoying and tedious, but they're actually really disturbing. I find it disturbing that there are onesies for baby boys that say things like, I'm a boob man. I mean, I'm not saying that that is the one thing that is the key to everything, but it's just very strange that a small baby they don't even really have genders yet. They've just got genitalia. That you would impart on a small baby, I'm a boob man, and people would be like, oh yeah, just like his dad. But if you put a little girl in a onesie that said, I'm a boob girl, people would be like, well, why? That's really weird, But also, there's a lot of paranoia and anxiety around sexualizing girls too early. And the too early is key there, because there's no paranoia about sexualizing girls after the age of 14 or 15. At that point, girls are just supposed to expect it and deal with it. But we're not supposed to sexualize little girls, but there's no problem with talking about little boys as, oh, he's a ladies' man, or he's a boob man, or he's a leg man, or, looking at two little kids who happen to be a boy and a girl, and having people say, oh, God, wouldn't it be great if they grow up and get married? One of the things that breaks my heart is hearing stories about little boys who show an interest in toys or clothes that are coded as traditionally feminine, and having those interests taken away from them because that's not acceptable for a little boy.
Were there a few people on the receiving end of some strong language from you when you were at that age, when you had a young baby and you were coming face to face with that kind of gender stereotyping amongst people you meet in shop assistants or other mothers and so on, fathers and so on?
People very often assume that I have a daughter, and I think that's really interesting because I actually think it's just because my son has very long eyelashes. And I know that sounds funny, but I think it's just so used to these very feminine depictions of children in animation and in drawings and in picture books and stuff that people go, oh, long eyelashes, girl. He's got hair, so girl. Or he's wearing a pink jumper, so it must be a girl. In fact, there's a story in the book of this woman when my son was about 5 months old, and he was wearing a pink onesie and he was asleep in the carrier. And firstly, she did that annoying thing where she was trying to get in and, all the mums in the room know what I'm talking about, trying to get in and have a peek. And she said, oh, what's her name? And I said, I'm not going to say his name on radio, but I thought in that case, I was like, oh, I'm going to challenge her stereotypes. And she said, but he's wearing pink. And I just said, so he is. It was just astonishing how shocked she was by this. And, you know, for a society that prides itself on being so progressive and advanced, the fact that we can still be felled by the sight of a baby boy in pink is pretty damning.
Yeah. I was interested in something you said earlier, actually, about the patriarchy, and women have long spoken about how harmful patriarchy is to their lives, how constricting and oppressive it is to how they live their lives. But if you look, for example, at the rates of suicide and depression amongst men, you will see that all is not well amongst men. Are men victims of the very system that also gives them power, the patriarchal system?
Absolutely. Patriarchy gives men privilege in certain ways, and certainly gives men privilege over women, and particularly if they have extra layers of privilege such as race, class, gender identity, location even. But I think it also acts as a prison in lots of ways, and it particularly acts as a prison for men who fail to conform to what it is patriarchy demands of them. The stories that I've heard from men, particularly even since this book has been released, who've read it and who've identified with it because their adolescence felt to them like a hostile place, has been very revealing. But I think that one of the things that is important to remember is that some men will take those lessons and they will use them to positive ends. They will try to do things differently. They will find some strength in how they don't conform, and they will have positive, healthy relationships with other humans, but specifically other women. But some of the other men, and a lot of them it seems, take the harm that they experience under patriarchy and they expel it 100-fold on the women around them. And, you know, it's almost like there are two categories. I mean, obviously there's lots of different categories, but there are two clear categories. And one is the man who is 100% entitled and privileged by patriarchy because of all of those other things I mentioned before that conspire to put him at the top of the pile. And these are the men who, like Brett Kavanaugh, who can do and say and get away with whatever it is that they want and express such potent rage and fury when a woman turns up at some point to place an obstacle in the path, with the smooth path to power that was supposed to be their inheritance, that was their legacy. That's one category. And then there's the other men who are angry and toxic and misguided and express rage and hatred towards women, especially because they feel they lack power over them, whose real grievance actually is that they recognise on some level that patriarchy demands these things of them and will privilege men who excel at patriarchy. And their fight is actually with where they fit in that system. Their grievance is with how they compare to other men. But rather than addressing that, and rather than saying, well, let's all work together to dismantle the system that is oppressive to everybody, those men choose to, as I said, expel that rage and hatred against the women who they feel should at least be the one thing they get to control.
Big ideas on RN. Broadcast, podcast, and on the ABC Listen app.
I'm in conversation with author Clementine Ford about her book, Boys Will Be Boys. During this discussion, we talk about issues surrounding sexual assault and rape. You might want to turn this off if the kids are listening. There's a toxic brotherhood, you believe, that can lead to some terrible acts of humiliation and sexual assault, which you document in the book. The men who engage in this, you say, delight in humiliation that rests at the centre of this swaggering machismo. What about the young men who find themselves in these situations where, say, a group of their friends are preying or about to prey on a young woman who's intoxicated or initiate some form of humiliation, and they don't want to be involved? What stops them from walking away? What stops them from sticking up for that woman?
There's never going to be, in a group of men who are engaging in ritual acts of humiliation, there will never be 10 ringleaders. There's always going to be 1 or 2 ringleaders and then conformists. Most people are followers. And most people struggle to speak out against the power structures around them. I think that what we need to do is to empower young men to be able to speak out against each other, to be able to challenge what it is that is being asked of them in order to prove their loyalty to the pack, and really challenge the toxic bonds of brotherhood that suggest that if we all do this together, then we're in it together, and you don't dog the boys. It's not just about sexual violence or humiliation used against women. It's also about humiliation used against men. And I just want to read a quote from Bell Hooks that I reference in the introduction, where she says that it's from her book, The Will to Change Men, Masculinity and Love. And she writes, "The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem." And I feel like that is so obvious when you actually think about it, and it should be obvious actually to most men who hear it, to recognize how that power plays out and how easy it is to become party to a gross, violent and criminal act because it's too difficult to say, I don't want to be here and I don't think that this is right. One of the stories that I reference is a case that actually happened in Brisbane, and it was 4 young men who were at a party, and they'd been drinking because people are allowed to drink, and one of the men who was supposed to be their friend passed out. And so the 3 other men decided it would be really funny. I'm sorry, I'm going to mention an act of sexual assault here. They decided it would be really funny to anally rape him with a beer bottle and film it and post it on social media. And this young man very bravely reported that assault to police, and the men went to trial and they were miraculously found guilty. Of course, there's a difference between how male and female victims are treated in the legal system. And one of them had pleaded guilty and received a suspended sentence, but the others were given a 12-month sentence. And the way that the community around them responded was really distressing, because they reinforced the idea that this was just a prank. It was just a joke. They hadn't meant anything by it, and it was a terrible miscarriage of justice that these boys were going to jail. Now, I don't think that the penal system is actually necessarily the best place to deal with criminal behaviour. But I also think that what we need to address is this myth that sexual assault is treated very seriously by everyone, that no one, the amount of men I've spoken to who will swear blind that there's no such thing as rape culture because everyone hates rapists. Rapists get really long sentences, which of course is not true.
It's a definition of rape, though, that they've, I think, invented in their own head that maybe doesn't include what you're including. Well,
it doesn't include the vast majority of acts of sexual violence. It's really just the Adrian Bailey stereotype, the man who drags someone down an alleyway and produces a dead body at the end of it.
So, I mean, just on that issue and men's response to sexual harassment and sexual assault, how do you evaluate the response of men generally to #MeToo? Obviously, there is some defensiveness, which we have seen a bit of, but has it caused many men, do you think, to reflect upon how they've treated women or how they should treat women in the future?
Perhaps. I hope so. Whether or not they're having those conversations publicly is yet to be seen. But I mean, the tricky thing with that is as well that we're so used to rewarding men for such basic acts of decency. Like the old joke, why did the feminist man walk into the bar? Because it was set so low. We're so used to rewarding them for basic acts of decency that what I have seen is, on the rare occasion when men have come out and acknowledged their own past bad behaviour and ill treatment of women, that they've been heaped with praise for being so honest. And isn't it wonderful? And, you know, I saw a post like that the other day, and a man who was admitting to having groped one of his colleagues when they were teenagers, and, you know, saying that now he understood that was wrong and that men needed to do this work and recognize what they had done in the past, which is all true and great. But women in the comments just sort of bending over backwards to talk about how wonderful it was that he'd done this self-reflection. And one woman saying, you know, men working on their inner spiritual health is the new sexy. And I was just like, this guy's just admitted to sexually assaulting someone, and all of you want to sleep with him. It's really strange. But I think that, you know, the other frustrating thing about men's reaction to Me Too is that they just seem so astonished by it. You know, I just had no idea that this was what was going on, isn't it? Whoa, I had no idea that all the women in my life had these terrible stories of sexual harassment. It's just awful. You know, we men just need to do better. And you think, A, if you had no idea that this was going on, it means that you don't pay any attention when women speak. And B, we have had hashtag movements before where women have stood in front of the world and bled their trauma to people, and it's always the role of people who've been victimized and traumatized to actually have to try and convince people that it happened. So, you know, Dr. Blasey having to stand before the congressional hearing and talk about one of the most traumatic moments of her life, only to then be inundated with even more death threats and be called not just by members of the public but by columnists and the President of the United States liars. You know, to have Donald Trump stand up at a rally and mock her in front of people. That's what's frustrating, is that nothing that Me Too revealed is new information, and it hasn't been private and secret. It's just that men don't listen, and when they do, they forget.
Rest assured, we're not going to talk about rape and sexual assault all night, although we may come back to it and perhaps look at how the legal system can deal with this matter a bit better if we have some time. But toxic masculinity doesn't just manifest itself in serious criminal offences like that. There are more, you might think, banal matters like, for example, the housework. But the housework is no laughing matter, Clementine. I mean,
it certainly is not. I don't laugh when I do it. It
wasn't a laughing matter and hasn't been a laughing matter in your relationship at times. I hope you've moved through that. But there's a whole idea of domestic unpaid labour being done mostly by women is a serious issue, and if we want to move toward greater gender equality, needs to be dealt with. Why is it important that men do more of the domestic work around the house?
Well, men have to do their equal share around the house. The second chapter of this book is called A Woman's Place, and it deals really specifically with heterosexual relationships, particularly where there are children. Because the moment a man and a woman move in together into a romantic situation, the woman's workload goes up and the man's workload goes down. And this is regardless of whether or not the man has been capable of taking care of himself or living alone or in a share house. It's just falling into subconscious conditioned gender roles. Part of that is because what we witness when we grow up, which is again why we need to challenge it, because we need to question what it is. If there are children in the house, we need to question what it is they're learning about heterosexual dynamics. But also that it's just assumed that this is work that women do. And I think that women sometimes oftentimes make the mistake of not wanting to have the arguments because it's tedious, it's boring, it's repetitive, and it feels like there's only so many times you can argue with what is supposed to be a grown adult about how much work they're doing around the house. It detracts from the pleasure of your relationship. And so what women often end up doing is saying, oh, it's just easier to do it myself. I just don't want to have another argument about it. And men rely on women being the ones to pick up the slack. It's the same way with when children come along, particularly if you're the birth parent. Of course, in the immediate months after a child is born, the person who's given birth to them will have certain requirements that no one else can provide. And that may not just be that they're breastfeeding, but it may be that it's comfort. But that changes very quickly, but the dynamic doesn't. And it's women who pick up the slack when it comes to childcare. It's women who definitely bear the brunt, if not the totality of the mental load when it comes to organising everything, running the house as if it's a workplace, and being, that horrible joke that I hate when women say, oh, I'm the CEO of the house. Really? Are you on a 6-figure salary? I don't think you're the CEO. I think you're the janitor, maybe. But what women need to do, the burden should not be on women to change these dynamics. The burden should be on men actually stepping up and being grown-ups. But what if you want to challenge those dynamics, what women need to do is insist on having the arguments. And they are tedious and they are boring. But if you don't have them, then you will find yourself in the position where you just do it because it's just easier. And you make jokes like, oh, he's my 4th child. And I really hate that one too. Like, the infantilization of men that allows them to get away with doing nothing around the house or doing very little because he's just like a big kid. He's the 4th child.
I really enjoyed the chapter on popular culture and films. The fact that, like so many of us, we grew up watching and consuming popular culture, much of it American popular culture, much of it Hollywood movies, movies that we didn't recognise at the time. Well, I didn't recognise at the time when I was a 8, 9, 10-year-old. These are films that are perpetuating and reinforcing the very gender norms that you've spent so long trying to shake up. Women were and remain marginal to those storylines. Even today, it's the men who are the heroes of most of the films, and the so-called women's films that do get made today are by and large niche films. How does this culture, this popular culture, continue to condition men and shape how we see the role of men in society?
Well, we assume incorrectly that pop culture holds up a mirror to society as it is. If that were true, then there would be a lot fewer white people in it. The Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media found, they've done incredible work looking at the way that gender is represented across media forms, and they found that in most crowd scenes in Hollywood, women take up about 17% of space. When that increases, and people think that that's even, but when that increases to something even less than 50%, but that's a bit more, so say around 30%, people think that there are too many women in the room or too many women in the crowd scene, and that it's political correctness gone mad. And you would think that people particularly like to think that the media that we give our children to consume is very empowering for them, particularly for little girls. And you would think that even though that is our experience of films made for an adult audience, that it would be different when it came to films and media designed for children. But it's actually not so. It's the statistics are the same across the board, which is roughly that women take up around 21% of speaking roles. They occupy around 30% of roles in the production. It's very uncommon for them to be shown with a job. And obviously, people in the room might know about the Bechdel test, which says that to pass the Bechdel test, a film has to have at least 2 women in it who talk to each other about something other than a man. And it's very uncommon for films to pass the Bechdel test. Then you get a film coming out like Ghostbusters, which has 4 women in it, and it's like the world is ending. Men will not abide. How can you ruin my childhood like this?
Well, the response was incredible, actually, wasn't it, to that film?
It was brutal. I mean, it was the most downvoted trailer on YouTube in history, and men still go, and I know that they still go to the trailer to downvote it because they say so in the comments. Oh, I just came back here to downvote it again. LOL! And you just think, the funny thing about that is that it's women who are constantly accused of being hysterical and oversensitive and being unable to handle the reality of the world. And you have whole legions of men that have actually made it a political mission to make sure that Paul Feig knows how much he ruined their lives. Same with Star Wars. The new iterations of the Star Wars universe experienced exactly the same level of hostility from men who were outraged that not only was there a female hero, but there was a black hero. Again, political correctness gone mad. Do you know, an interesting thing that I found out while writing this chapter, Girls on Film, is that in the first Star Wars trilogy, when you take out Princess Leia. There's only 3 other female characters who have speaking roles in the first trilogy, 1 in each film, and the totality of their speaking amounts to 1 minute and 3 seconds. But sure, having a woman as a hero and a black man is unrealistic.
On RN, this is Big Ideas with Paul Barclay. You can listen back to plenty of other big ideas online or on the ABC Listen app.
I'm talking with feminist writer Clementine Ford. This discussion includes talk about sexual assault and rape, so might not be appropriate for everyone. Few people have fallen from public favour more spectacularly than actor Kevin Spacey, who faces several accusations of sexual misconduct. His latest film reportedly made less than $500 at the US box office on its opening weekend. What does this tell us about the power of #MeToo? Clementine Ford.
There's an interesting point to be made there as well, and they should turn their back on Kevin Spacey, but they're turning their back because Kevin Spacey targeted boys. So it's a whole mix of homophobia in with that as well. No one questions a male victim of priests. I mean, priests do, but it's very difficult to imagine the same response that, say, again, Dr. Blasey received being directed at, the brave survivors of childhood sexual abuse at the hands of the clergy, particularly if they're boys. People are very afraid of boys being sexually abused, but when it's girls talking about sexual violence or enduring sexual violence, the story is suddenly very different. No one has turned their back on the multitude of men that I list in the final chapter who you hear all the time that men's careers are destroyed by allegations. Women have to be so careful about what they say because men's careers will just be destroyed by false allegations. And the last chapter is just a glossary of men who have been either accused or even convicted of some form of violence against women, and their careers are thriving fine. One of those men is Louis C.K., who finally admitted at the end of last year to years of allegations directed against him for masturbating in front of women who had far less power than he did in his industry, some of whom had their careers destroyed because they spoke out against it. And he always treated those allegations as if it was beneath him to even acknowledge it, beneath such a great man as him to even acknowledge it. And when it became impossible for him to go on doing that, and he finally had to issue some sort of tepid apology, where he didn't say sorry, by the way, he disappeared, took a few months off, and now has just done his second unpromoted event where he just popped up in front of an audience without their consent. What a surprise. But certainly there are a number of people who would have turned their back on Kevin Spacey who think that it's unfair that Louis C.K. should have to suffer any consequences for his actions, and say things like, well, how long should he have to suffer for? I don't know, longer than a year.
I was going to ask you about that chapter, the annotated list of men who have been accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault. It includes a variety of people from, at one end of the spectrum, Bill Cosby, who has just been sentenced to prison. But more to the point, I was wondering what was the point of that chapter? What were you trying to get across by listing the men in that chapter? It's a grab bag of men and a grab bag of circumstances.
I originally conceived that chapter, which is called Witch Hunt, as an exploration of how false that argument is, that women who make allegations against men are able to, that as if we have the power somehow to destroy men's lives. The chapter actually opens with a tweet from Donald Trump, who was responding to the resignation of a senior White House aide, Rob Porter, who had for years had allegations against him from 2 former spouses and 1 ex-girlfriend that he'd been physically abusive towards them. He had been investigated by the FBI in the lead up to him being given security clearance, and the FBI knew about these claims because they'd spoken to the silence breakers, and they'd also. It took longer for him to get a security clearance than anyone else. But the White House insisted that he had done nothing wrong, that they believed him, of course. And after he finally tendered his resignation, Donald Trump tweeted something, I'll paraphrase, but something along the lines of, men's lives are being destroyed by allegations. Some are true and some are false, but there's no coming back from those allegations, so people need to be very careful about what they say. Donald Trump, by the way, has been accused by more than 16 women of sexual assault and rape, one of whom was his former wife. Still the president. So not sure that whole career-destroying thing is actually that true. But rather than sort of use a lot of words to explain why that argument is so false, I thought it would just be powerful and visually arresting to actually just have a list. So as you're reading through this list, and it could have been so much longer, but obviously time constraints meant that I had to limit it to around 60 men. But as you're reading through, and some of them you'll know about and some of them you won't know about, it just becomes very obvious that actually, no, allegations, even convictions, do nothing to destroy men's careers. Even Bill Cosby is finally going to jail, but people knew about him for decades and nothing happened. People knew about Harvey Weinstein for decades and nothing happened. There are men in there who have been accused of very serious crimes who have gone on to occupy some of the highest levels of power in society. And yes, allegations can have a serious impact on the lives of perpetrators, but false allegations are around the same as any other crime, and that's around 2 to 8%. And actually, one of the other things that I discovered while writing this book, that even the way that we frame false allegations isn't quite correct, because a false allegation doesn't mean she lied. A false allegation might mean that she dropped the charges. And we know that there are numerous reasons why someone who has even brought an allegation to police in the first place might choose to drop the charge and drop the pursuit. It might also mean that she is considered an unreliable witness by police because of her foggy memory or because they don't think that it's a prosecutable offence. The other thing as well that I think is very important for us to reflect on is that it may be that she's offered willingly falsified versions of what happened because she understands you have to be the perfect rape victim. There's a case that I look at in one of the chapters, Asking for It, which is it was a very difficult chapter to write because I looked at a lot of different circumstances of rape that had occurred and that had resulted not necessarily in a trial, and some that resulted in a trial, where it's very obvious that the victim is the one being put on trial and being judged by the community. And the way that the community, who rally around powerful men in particular, particularly when those men are considered young with future potential or come from valued sporting teams, is really toxic. And the women who've had to move home numerous times because they dared to bring a charge against a soccer player or a football player, and their names have been leaked to the public and they've received death threats. There's a case in there that I write about that happened in Belfast where two rugby players were accused of raping a woman at a party, and two other men were defendants in that trial, one for obstruction of justice and one for indecent exposure because he tried to join in. This woman was that 4 different defendants in the same trial, so 4 different defence lawyers, and this woman was cross-examined for 8 days straight. And in the end, when you read through the trial and everything that happened and the WhatsApp discussion that happened amongst the men afterwards and the WhatsApp discussion that happened with her and her friends immediately afterwards, and by the way, the man who was on trial for accused of obstruction of justice was there because he didn't tell the police that she told him the next day that it wasn't consensual because, as he said, they didn't ask me. And all of these men were found not guilty.
Look, we could talk about this all night. There's the fact that the juries are frequently dominated by men. There is no necessity that the juries be gender balanced. It's a real issue in need of attention. I just wanted to get a sense. There's 700 people in this room tonight. If you're a bloke, can you put up your hand?
Don't clap the men for coming.
So the purpose of that was not so that you could clap, but just so I could get an idea of how many men were sufficiently engaged with the discussion tonight and the book that they decided to come along. 20 or 30 maybe out of 700. So Clementine, you're wanting to start a conversation as a result of this book with men?
Well, I just wanted to let all those men know that now is where we reveal we've brought you here to kill you. So if you could just line up in front, please. We'll make it quick.
It's like a twisted reality television show that's taking place as we speak.
Yeah, I think that it's very important. The reason I said so forcefully don't clap is because women especially, again, it comes back to that low bar. We're so conditioned to reward men.
Yeah, I suppose the point I was making, though, is that...
No, but I'll answer your question. What I would like men to do is I'd like them to engage with the content and to read the book and discuss it with each other.
Yeah.
To not just discuss it with their partners or discuss it with their female friends, and do that as well, and you will get a much bigger picture if you do it that way too. But I think it's really essential that you have these conversations with each other. You talk about what your experience of masculinity has been, both the positive and the negative parts of it. You talk about what it was like to grow up in a world that socialized you in a certain way as a man and that expected certain things of you. And then you talk about what kind of solutions you could come up with to make things different for your sons if you have them, for your friends, and for all children. You shouldn't have to place someone in relation to you as a friend or a family member in order to care about how the world will pan out for them. And then I think you go out and you talk about it with your colleagues. You talk about it with other men. You encourage men to be the ones who are having the conversation with each other about this and to be the ones who are central to dismantling what it is toxic masculinity and patriarchy does to men.
Yeah, I was talking to David Nowat, who's an expert on the alt-right in America, and amongst their ranks is a swathe of men's rights activists, so a subset of the alt-right are the types of people that tweet nasty things at you, Clem. I was trying to get a sense of what's the central kind of grievance that the American alt-right, which David spent a lot of time looking at, has, and therefore what's the grievance of the men in this movement? And I was wondering, is it, economic disenfranchisement and globalisation, which means they can no longer get jobs? And he said, no, it's none of that. He said they are witnessing a changing country, and they are seeing migrants coming into that country, a greater number of Hispanic people. They are seeing women achieving more equality. They're seeing African Americans achieving more equality. And they see this as a zero-sum game. So as women gain more equality, they lose out of the equation. And so they feel like losers as others are emancipated. Do you think that's part of the issue that you're addressing and that you're talking about in your book, Toxic Masculinity? That explains the defensiveness that we're witnessing?
I think it partly explains it. I think that the alt-right is largely made up of that second category of men I spoke about before, who feel like who recognise that they don't actually have much power within the hierarchy of men, but they feel like who they are entitled to have power over is women and migrants and other marginalised groups who aren't supposed to be able to speak back to them. And when they do encounter those groups challenging what they perceive to be their God-given authority, they feel, I think, the sting of not fitting into the hierarchy even more. And I think that's what they're reacting against. But I actually think that what we also need to be very honest about when we talk about gender equality, specifically in this case, but also all forms of equality and the liberation of marginalised groups from the oppression that they experience, is that equality does mean a loss for people. It means gains in so many ways as well. It means that the world itself gains, but structurally and tangibly, it means that white men in particular will lose things. White men will lose their grip on government. They'll lose their grip on being, in charge of all the companies in the world. They'll probably lose a lot of column space and radio shows and so on and so forth. This is the mistake that people make. Is they think that equality can be achieved without actually upsetting the apple cart. But that's impossible. And I feel like once we start being honest about that, and we will encounter anger for it, there will be people who say, well, if I have to lose something, how does that make it fair? You say, well, because you guys have everything. If a group of children, if one child has 10 cakes and there are 5 children who have 1 cake each, if he has to give some of those away so everyone's got... I'm not going to do the maths there. I'm just a girl. That's what equality looks like. The kid loses some cake and everyone has the same.
I do a lot of these conversations around social issues and social change, and I often get letters coming in saying, Paul, where's the hope? Where's the hope? So-and-so was talking about how buggered everything is. So I'll ask you, after researching and writing this book and taking a look at toxic masculinity, and there's a litany of very confronting material in this book. At the end of it all, though, do you see hope, and do you see the green shoots of change? And I suppose most importantly at all, do you see men who want to change and who see that becoming and embracing a different form of masculinity makes their lives ultimately better lives?
I do feel hopeful. You'd have to feel hopeful at the end of writing a book like this, because otherwise you would never leave your house again. But I feel hopeful for a number of reasons. And one of those is that I have many, many more men now than even 5 years ago who want to have conversations with me about what they can do to be a part of change, who are interested in having conversations with each other about how to dismantle all of this, who recognise even that the ideals that they grew up with were not always, and in fact in many cases were harmful to them and to other people, who want to do better by their children and who are willing to kind of go along on what this journey means. What they need to realise, and many of them do, which is also a source for hope, but what men need to realise is that it's not enough to just want to be a part of making things different. It actually requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of discomfort. It will involve a lot of discomfort. It's not a very nice experience to be confronted with all of the ways that you benefit in the world, and to be confronted with all the things that you have to do in order to change that. But I do think that in my experience, there are a lot of men who are willing to do that work. And I guess ultimately the thing that gives me the most hope is not just my son, but also all of the other little boys that I have in my life, my nephews, my friends' children. And I have hope when looking at that, because I think children are inherently hopeful. I think they provide hope to people. They are innocent. They have no idea what the world has in store for them. And they explore with such joy and with such openness and with so much heart that you can't help but feel hopeful for a better world when you look at that. The trick is that we as their guiders, and whether or not we're their parents or not, we as community members who all have responsibility for taking care of the children in our midst, have a responsibility to make sure they maintain that hope and they maintain that innocence and that joy and that thrill of exploration, and that we don't, as people, work to break them.
I was speaking to writer Clementine Ford at the Greek Club in Brisbane. Her book, Boys Will Be Boys, is published by Allen and Unwin. That's it for this Big Ideas on RN and online. I'm Paul Barclay. If you enjoy the program, you can rate us on iTunes. I'd love it if you did. Until next time, bye for now.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. You can discover more ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.
Lowell Community Radio, Channel 1, KAKU-LP Kahilui, KBOG-LP Bandon, KFZR-LP Fraser Park, KIEZ-LP.
Senior Trump administration officials met this Saturday with Democratic congressional staffers, but they failed to break a deadlock over a proposed border wall and end a 2-week-old partial government shutdown. President Trump said on Twitter that Vice President Mike Pence had briefed him on the meeting and that not much headway had been made. A second meeting is scheduled for this Sunday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in a statement released Saturday, the senseless uncertainty and chaos of the Trump shutdown must end now. Her statement said next week Democrats would begin passing individual appropriations bills to reopen all government agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, so Americans can get their tax refunds on time. Trump is demanding more than $5.5 billion to pay for a border wall. Congressional Democrats have said that they will not fund it, calling it foolish and wasteful. A top admiral at the Pentagon, Rear Admiral Kevin Sweeney, has resigned just days after his boss, former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, left the Defense Department. In a statement Saturday, Sweeney, the chief of staff to the secretary, said it was an honor to serve again alongside the men and women of the Department of Defense. He had held the post since 2017. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis announced his resignation in December, shortly after President Trump announced the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. Mattis left his post earlier in the week. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has warned the Syrian government it should not see the impending U.S. military withdrawal from the country as an invitation to use chemical weapons. Bolton is on a multinational trip to the Middle East after President Trump's announcement that the United States would actually be pulling its troops out of Syria. It came as a surprise to many. This is VOA News. Russia says it is too early to consider the exchange of an American man being held in Moscow on suspicion of spying. AP correspondent Ben Thomas.
Russian authorities detained Paul Whelan late last month. His arrest led to speculation that Russia could be using him to bargain for the release of Maria Butina. The Russian woman pleaded guilty earlier in December to acting as a foreign agent in the United States. But Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov says it's premature to discuss a possible swap because Whelan hasn't been formally charged yet. Officials have not provided details of his suspected activities. Whelan's family has said he was in Moscow to attend a wedding. Ben Thomas, Washington.
The head of Congo's election commission says that plans to announce the winner of the country's presidential election cannot move forward as scheduled for Sunday. Corneille Ananga said the commission has received less than half of the vote tally sheets as of next Saturday. He said it was not clear when the results would be ready to announce. An electoral commission spokesman said the commission would hold a meeting Sunday to decide when results will be announced. The delay is the latest in a series of setbacks in the poll to pick a successor to the president who has ruled the country since his father was assassinated in 2001. The December 30th vote could mark the DRC's first democratic transition of power since independence from Belgium in 1960. French security forces fired tear gas and flashbang ammunition at protesters during a march through picturesque central Paris as several thousand supporters of Yellow Vest movement kept up pressure on President Emmanuel Macron. With the first action of 2019, we get more from AP correspondent Zaria Shackley.
Smoke and tear gas wafted above various parts of the French capital as riot police, nearly invisible at the start of the demonstration, moved front and center when protesters deviated from an officially approved path. Police boats patrolled the river while beyond the Seine, motorcycles and a car were set on fire on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a main left bank thoroughfare. The march on the 8th consecutive Saturday of Yellow Vest protests had been declared in advance and approved, in contrast to some illegal December demonstrations that degenerated into vandalism, looting and chaos. I'm Zaria Shakili.
And an Egyptian police officer was killed Saturday while attempting to defuse a bomb found near a church in an eastern Cairo suburb less than 2 days before Egyptian Christians celebrate the Coptic Christmas, The device was one of two found inside a bag on a nearby rooftop, 3 security sources and state media reported. I'm Tommy McNeil, VOA News.
This is an ABC podcast.
Welcome to Big Ideas on RN and on the ABC Listen app. Paul Barclay with you. Have you ever wondered, is there something innate or biological that may help to explain male violence? Testosterone makes men tall and deeper voiced. Could it also be at the root of male aggression and other characteristics branded as masculine? Do hormones maketh the man and indeed the woman? These questions suggest a boys will be boys or men are from Mars, women are from Venus view of the world. But this idea of essential gender differences being somehow biologically programmed is firmly rejected by my guest on this Big Ideas.
We talk about men and women as kind of generic groups, but that stereotype describes almost nobody at all.
Cordelia Fine is the author of Testosterone Rex, Unmaking the Myths of Our Gendered Minds. She's a psychologist, feminist and professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Melbourne. Cordelia spoke with me at the Bendigo Writers' Festival. Morning, Cordelia.
Good morning.
This session is called What Makes a Man, so this seems like a good place to start the conversation. To what extent is it testosterone that makes a man?
My interest has never been in the sort of making of reproductive systems. I leave that to other disciplines and other scientists. My interests have always been in the kinds of characteristics that have been sort of drawn on to explain why we see the inequalities that we have, in society and in the workplace. So in Delusions of Gender, I was interested in this idea that prenatal testosterone, which has a sort of a period of increase in the fetuses of males, which is part of the sort of formation of the reproductive system, also masculinizes the brain in a way that makes boys born sort of more predisposed to be understanding the world, understanding how the world works, and that's sort of been taken as an explanation for why we still see so much segregation in the kinds of occupations and industries that men and women still tend to segregate into. And in this third book of mine, Testosterone Rex, I'm interested in this idea of testosterone as the hormonal essence of masculinity that drives men to be driven to make it to the top. So regardless of what industry you're talking about, even industries and roles and occupations where you actually have more women than men at the entry level and the middle levels, wherever you look at, when you look up, the higher up you see, the more men you see and the fewer women you see. So I've been looking at this idea of a sort of biological predisposition to men kind of being the ones who want to achieve that, are willing to take the risks and compete to achieve that higher status and power.
Well, that's right. Men are different to women in a biological sense, and frequently it is, for example, the presence of a penis. He has a dick. That is used as an explanation for all manner of bad behaviour, for all manner of overly aggressive behaviour, for men interrupting meetings. You hear this expression used all of the time. Is there any relationship that you've been able to detect at all between male behaviour and their biological and hormonal differences to women?
Well, when I was starting the research for this book, I was interested in this idea of testosterone as the kind of hormonal essence of masculinity that is associated with sort of positive traits like, a go-getting attitude and that willing to take the risks that you need to take to sort of do amazing and incredible things, but at the same time also that comes with this sort of darker side of sort of trampling over other people on your way to the top. But when I was writing the book, I sort of I realised that you have to think about you have to be very careful about thinking about what is it that you're actually trying to explain here. So when we talk in these very generic ways, men are like this, they behave really badly. Women are like that, they're kind and compassionate. When you talk in those very generic ways, something like, well, it must be the testosterone seems like a really natural explanation for it. We know that men have, on average, much more testosterone than women do. But when you start to look very closely at the actual patterns of differences and similarities between men and women, it becomes clear that some kind of sort of simple hormonal difference can't be playing a sort of simple, powerful, driving role in diverging that behaviour, because our patterns of behaviour are so sort of very complex and overlapping. We talk about men and women as kind of generic groups, but that stereotype describes almost nobody at all. One really good example to illustrate this is the idea of risk-taking. So this is one of the characteristics that I was really interested in my book, because so often, we have books like Lean In. Women don't get to the top because they're not willing to sort of take the risk of sit at the table and, take those career risks to get to the top. And people in economics, for example, are interested in whether differences in testosterone are sort of behind differences in financial risk-taking, for example. So this idea that this is a biological difference that contributes to differences in risk-taking. But when you start to look about risk-taking and think about risk-taking in a more careful way, it starts to very quickly become much more complicated than that. So although it's a sort of trope, men are risk-taking and women are risk-averse, when you actually ask people what kinds of risks they're willing to take, you find that they're really idiosyncratic in what kinds of risks they're willing to take. So people who love the idea of jumping out of a plane attached to a parachute, for example, may be really reluctant to put their superannuation in high-risk, high-growth portfolios, for example. Somebody who is really willing to speak up about sexual harassment in the workplace, which, as we all know, can be a very risky things to do professionally, may not be interested in going to Crown Casino and gambling, for example. So the kinds of risks that people are willing to take is quite idiosyncratic, and you can already start to see, well, if we're talking about risk takers being people with higher testosterone, what kind of risk taker do we expect them to be? Because chances are they're not going to be a risk taker across the board.
Not to mention, for example, becoming pregnant and giving birth, a risky activity that women exclusively do, and men don't at all, obviously.
That's right, and statistics from the US show that you're actually more likely to suffer injury or death from giving birth than you are from skydiving. I think the statistic. I think in the US there's.
Don't let that put you off, by the way.
It just goes to show how safe skydiving is. But this is a sort of serious point that when we think of risks, we have this link in our mind between risk taking and masculinity. So we talk about grow some balls, we talk about big, hairy, audacious goals in business. It's linked very closely in our mind with the kinds of things that men do, and the kinds of risks that women take kind of go under the radar. We tend not to think about them and acknowledge that the risks that women quite regularly take.
And it's linked, isn't it, to this idea that in evolutionary biology that men evolved supposedly to be risk-taking and competitive because these qualities were needed to help them accrue the material and social resources that they required to therefore be attractive to women. That's kind of one of the purported statements that you hear, but there is no evidence that you've been able to find that backs that up.
Well, look, so this is it's been called the biological big picture by the philosopher of biology, John Dupre, and this is this really familiar chain of assumptions that goes from cheap sperm to CEOs. So most people, if they've sort of read any popular psychology books, will be able to connect the dots. So you have cheap sperm, so in theory you can impregnate lots of females, you can have, hit the jackpot in terms of reproductive success. In order to attract those females, you have to acquire lots of resources. So for a male, taking the risks to compete for partners and to compete for sort of status and resources is worth the risk because you can have such a big reproductive return. Whereas for females, any mediocre female can sort of achieve the goal of getting herself impregnated by one of these eager males. And, especially for mammals, there's a sort of limit to how many, it's much more expensive biologically for females to reproduce than for males. Now, this is the idea of sexual selection, that there's this stronger drive for males to compete and to impregnate females. And look, this is a principle that does apply to many species across the animal kingdom. But what evolutionary biology has been finding over the past few decades is that it's often much more complicated than that. So reproduction has not been solved in the same way universally across the animal kingdom. And things that had been overlooked before are now getting more attention. So, for example, reproduction isn't quite as cheap for males as might have been assumed. I mean, sperm is, although it's only a single sperm that's required to fertilise an egg, there's a lot of wastage, shall we say. There's a lot of nutrient-rich fluid that comes with it. There's the sort of courtship involved, which is time and energy and potentially dangerous. Where are all the females to come from? I mean, most of our evolutionary history, we haven't had Tinder. And there's a sort of limited number of females, and if all these other males are competing for them, this is, something that requires a lot of time and energy. And when it comes to our own species, unlike many other mammals, our sexual activity isn't under hormonal control. So a lot of other animals are much more efficient in the way they go about sexual activity. So it's timed so that things are going to work and fertilization is going to occur. And as we all know from personal experience or from reading, from study, human sexual activity is not like that at all. So we have sexual activity at times where it will not lead to reproduction. We have sexual activity with people for whom pregnancy will not occur. We have sexual activity in ways in which, I'm trying not to be too graphic here, you can sort of fill it all in your guts yourself. So we are really, we're unsurpassed in the inefficiency of our sexual activity. And what that means is that this idea that men, if only they could sort of go out and be promiscuous, they could be producing, hundreds of offspring, is actually a sort of claim that's really only accurate for very specific pockets of time in history, in particular a very well managed and organised harem probably is the sort of best route for that. But for your everyday Tom, Dick and Harry, it's actually a huge amount of work to get that done, to out-reproduce a monogamous male.
Well, look, while we're talking about reproduction, we should talk about the Angus Bateman fruit fly experiments from the 1940s. Now, Bateman reported a stronger relationship between mating and reproductive success in male fruit flies compared to female fruit flies. He concluded that sexual selection favours an undiscriminating eagerness in the males over a discriminating, essentially, passivity in females to obtain mates. And hence we have the promiscuous male as a characteristic, and we have the coy female. To what extent, firstly, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on revisiting that experiment. But secondly, to what extent did his experiments back in the 1940s help to form the basis of this idea of characteristics being based on sex?
Yeah, look, so this was a really, if you excuse the pun, a really seminal study in this area of research. So, as you said, Paul, this idea that males could, by having more mates, they could increase their reproductive success more than females could. Somebody, Patricia Garrity, who's an evolutionary biologist, contemporary evolutionary biologist, went back and sort of had a look at another look at those data, as have other evolutionary biologists, and they found that the data were just simply not as clear-cut as people had assumed. One aspect of it, which is really fascinating, is that when you take a close look at the data and you don't sort of combine them in the ways that Angus Bateman chose to, you can actually see that he actually found that reproductive success did increase for female fruit flies with the more mates that they had. So he although he didn't highlight it, it sort of disappeared in his discussion. He actually found the first evidence of the benefits of promiscuity to females. That was something that was sort of overlooked for decades, perhaps because it didn't quite fit in with the sort of sexual mores of the time, but it was a really quite fascinating finding. And so subsequently, there are many species to which this sort of Bateman's idea does apply, but equally there's sort of a growing number of species to which it has been found that actually there are benefits to females of promiscuity, and that female promiscuity is actually quite abundant throughout the animal kingdom.
So that whole thesis is essentially untrue. It's a myth based on those original experiments.
Look, I think I would be disinclined to go quite so far as to say that. I would say that this idea of the investment into reproduction is a factor that plays a role in how species kind of arrange their courtship and their mating, but it's just one of many factors. And some of the really fascinating examples are where when the environmental situation changes, these sort of sexual natures, male and female sexual natures, can actually reverse. So one example are bush crickets. So this is a situation in which actually the normal dynamic is reversed. So the males bring this sort of nutrient-rich sperm packet, and the females compete for the males. But when the females are put in an environment where there's pollen everywhere, we don't need the men's sperm packets anymore. For the males, and so then it's the males who start to compete. So, and there are other examples where when the sort of environmental kind of the animal's economic situations or material situation changes, they actually, the females can become the competitive ones, for example. So this is a really interesting example of things are done differently across species, but they also be done differently within species, just depending on what's going on around. So there's a sort of flexibility of behaviour that really is a sort of new insight, I suppose.
So this whole discussion really is about to what extent, if at all, can so-called masculine and feminine characteristics be explained by sex differences. Are you saying that there are no essential male and female characteristics? Cutting to the chase.
Cutting to the chase. Okay, so the first thing to say is that, as I mentioned before, so I've always been very interested in specific kinds of characteristics. So there are lots of things that are associated with men and women and boys and girls, from gender identity to sexual preferences and so on. I've always been interested in these kinds of characteristics that are drawn on to explain why we have inequalities in the workplace. So I've been interested in understanding the world versus being empathic, risk-taking and competitiveness. I think in terms of whether there are any essential traits in the sense of are there some kind of characteristics which cleanly distinguish men from women that we see in all men, in all times and all places? No, I cannot think of any of the kinds of sort of psychological characteristics that I've been interested in that would be regarded as a kind of essential characteristic. And I think that comes back to this point I was saying before, that, if you think about, for example, the complexity of risk-taking, so you'll have people in this room who will be, very risk-taking in some domains, not risk-taking in other kinds of domains. You can start to see how something like testosterone, it's hard to say when you say, well, some men in some situations, in some contexts, in some cultures will be more risk-taking in some domains than not others, and than some women. You can see that you don't think, oh, well, that must be the testosterone that explains that very nuanced and complex pattern of differences, when you stop to think about these, when you start describing these traits as if they were essential traits, when in fact they aren't.
But that's right, and the big case study that's used recently to prove that men are more risk-taking than women was the examination of the global financial crisis, where highly competitive, risk-taking, almost entirely men in the global financial system took these huge risks, and the whole global economy came tumbling down. And this was presented to us as the prime example, wasn't it, of just how essentially risk-taking men were compared to women.
That's right, and one of the sort of proposed responses to solving the issues that gave rise to the financial crisis was to have more women, senior women in finance. I'm not sure we've seen much evidence of that actually taking place at this stage. But the idea was that women's natural risk aversion would sort of temper this risk-taking appetite that men supposedly have. The problem with that point of view, one is that the data just don't support the idea that men are financially risk-taking, women are financially risk-averse. So when you look at the general population, you find that there's a huge amount of overlap in men and women's appetite for risk. And I think also when you start to look specifically at the people who are in those kinds of industries, the assumption that women are somehow risk-averse becomes even more problematic.
Cordelia Fine, author of Testosterone Rex, challenging the notion that men are inherently more prone to risk-taking than women.
I think just in general it's fair to say that trying to guess someone's risk appetite from whether they're male or female is often not that much better than tossing a coin. But I think that the second problematic aspect of this idea is that it's really a bit of a red herring. I mean, the systemic issues that enabled the global financial crisis to arrive from the sort of, the sort of saturation of conflicts of interest, and the fact that it wasn't their own money that they were taking risks with, and the taxpayers came along to make everything all right again. The idea that one could solve these sort of huge systemic and cultural issues just by sort of bringing in a few women is a very simplistic point.
So we'd still be having a banking royal commission in Australia even if there had been more women at the helm of Australia's banks and financial institutions, you think?
So I think we have to sort of draw a distinction between, what we expect an individual woman to bring to a board, and then also just think more generally about, it's hard to imagine that if we had a finance industry that was actually gender balanced, that might not have some sort of larger effect on that, that might reflect a cultural change. Potentially, but the idea that having a few women is going to change in industry from one that is, as we were seeing it appear in the Royal Commission, to one where customers' interests are, first and foremost in every kind of product or decision, does seem a bit naive.
We'll come back to that issue actually of more women in, say, the corporate sector and the justifications that are being used for it. This interesting analysis that you've made of that. I'm interested in another one of the things you hear, the differences between male and female brains. How similar are male and female brains? Are there any biological differences that could manifest in different behaviours? I understood there were some biological differences between male and female brains, and, for example, there are some drugs that react differently in male and female brains. Can you talk us through that a bit?
Yeah, look, so our brains aren't asexual. Biological sex, by which I mean the sort of genetic and hormonal components of sex, do influence brain development and brain function. The question from that is, you said, does that influence behaviour? Yep. And I guess that's the really key question. And people have a sort of tendency to assume that if you see some kind of difference in the brain, then that must manifest in a difference in behaviour. And certainly that may be the case. But the sort of way that neuroscientists are thinking about it has been sort of moved away from this idea that you have sort of testosterone, in fact, as the sort of key player in differentiating the brains of males and females, creating kind of distinct male circuits versus distinct female circuits, but rather these genetic and hormonal components of sex in interaction with many other kinds of factors, creating what's been described as sort of mosaics of more male typical and female typical features in quite complex ways. So a few years ago there was a survey of thousands of brains from data sets, these were human brains, to see whether this is also the case in humans. And what they did was they looked for the biggest 10 sex differences in the brain in the data sets. And interestingly, those top 10 were actually different depending on which data set they were using. And there was, even for these largest differences, there's still overlap between, you'll have plenty of females whose brains are sort of more male typical than an average male brain, for example. But then they looked to see to what extent those differences sort of added up in a consistent way. So can you create brains that go from like the most male brain up to the most female brain here? And what they actually found was that between a sort of quarter and a half of people's brains actually had a mix of male and female typical characteristics. Most people were kind of a bit in the intermediate zone, and only about fewer than 10% of people would have consistently all male typical brains or all female typical brains. And actually sometimes they had a brain that was sort of wrong for their own sort of biological sex. So the idea is that we actually have these multi-dimensional mosaics of brains, so you can't locate people into two categories, and you can't also even locate them on a continuum. We just have these very idiosyncratic brains, and that points to the fact that biological sex does influence the brain, but it's doing so, it's just one of many, many factors that influences development. So you could probably have a reasonable chance of guessing whether someone was male or female on the basis of their brain, but you can't do the opposite. You can't guess what someone's like or their brain is like on the basis of their brain. And the second question is how that actually links to behaviour. And I think one of the really interesting insights from animal research in this area is that sometimes we always assume that a brain difference must be serving a behavioural difference. But actually, sometimes these differences exist to cancel each other out, to enable the animals, the male and females, to behave in similar kinds of ways. So animals, females and animals of a species have to do many kinds of things that are quite similar. So, for example, females also have to compete for resources so that they can survive and have territories and so on, and that's actually really important for their reproductive success. But they have to do so in bodies that are, physically different to those of males. So, they might be smaller, they have different levels of chemicals and so on. And so sometimes it's a different neural means to the same behavioural end. These differences are actually cancelling each other out to enable males and females to behave in similar kinds of ways. So one fabulous example of this is actually in birds. So songbirds are one of the few examples where neuroscientists have actually been able to make a clear link between a sex difference in the brain and a sex differences in behaviour. It's actually really surprisingly hard to draw those links, and this is one of the few cases where they have really clear evidence that the sex difference in the brain is linked to the sex difference in behaviour, and it's to do with the region of the brain that's involved in song control. It's twice as large in males, and the males sing and the females don't. But in another species of songbird, the African weaver bird, that region of the brain is still twice as large in males, but there's another sex difference, which is that the gene expression is much larger in the females, and both songbirds, male and female, sing almost identical songs. So here you have a case where you actually have two sex differences in the brain, a kind of neural real estate difference and a gene expression difference, but they're actually serving to cancel each other out to enable the birds to do the same thing. So whenever we're looking at sex differences in the brain, the question is not, well, what difference in behaviour could this be behind, but also, is this just a fact that, men have slightly larger brains than women and they may need to be organised somewhat differently? Or, when men have higher levels of testosterone for physiological reasons, is there some difference in the brain that means that they're less responsive, for example, to that testosterone or to changes in that testosterone? And these are different kinds of scientific questions, and they're going to yield different kinds of answers.
But you're deconstructing some of these myths around male and female characteristics and their link to testosterone or hormones and so on. And I wonder why these myths of essential male and female characteristics, why are they so entrenched in our society? I've been speaking to some people about the fact that I was coming up here to talk to you today, and so we got talking about the gist of your book, and I could tell on the faces of many people that they just found it difficult to accept that there is no essential difference in characteristics biologically linked between male and female. So why do you think these views are so entrenched in parts of society?
Look, so there are average differences between men and women, and so people look for explanations for why that is. And I think it's important to say that the argument isn't that our biology doesn't influence us at all. So some of the most interesting research around testosterone is that in humans, the clearest evidence for links between hormones and behaviour or testosterone behaviour tends to be our behaviour or our social context actually influencing our hormonal levels, as opposed to our hormonal levels driving particular kinds of behaviour. So I think it's important to distinguish this idea from the idea that we're non-biological beings, that our biology doesn't influence us at all. But I think there are a number of different answers to the question that you're asking. So one is that often we draw on these ideas of essentialism to kind of make sense of all the inequality that we see around us, and to say, look, it's just natural for men to rule the world. It's just, it's unfortunate, but that's just nature, and nature isn't a feminist. That's a much more comfortable explanation than, we've got so much more work still to do. And you can actually see in studies that sometimes people will actually draw on these kind of essential beliefs in quite a strategic way when the status quo is under challenge. But I also think there's a sort of a more benign explanation in the sense that these ideas that I talk about in Testosterone Rex, they are based on scientific ideas. They're just last century scientific ideas. So they just haven't quite caught up with the way that the science has caught up, whether it's in evolutionary biology, whether it's in neuroscience, whether it's in the link between hormones and behaviours, or even whether it's in gender psychology itself. So gender psychology has sort of moved away from cataloguing the differences between men and women to looking at these more nuanced questions of how do all these differences add up in individual men and women? When are men and women the same? When are they different? What influences those kinds of differences?
Well, I mean, obviously we notice gender differences in society all of the time. I wonder, though, whether this is simply a case of us confusing biological determinism with gender roles, socialisation and the surrounding environment and how they shape, indeed, in some cases, pressure people into certain gender characteristics.
Yeah, well, I think one interesting idea is, people say when they see male aggression, for example, they say, well, that's testosterone. That's boys will be boys. But some of the most fascinating work in the area of hormones and behaviour has been looking at how these kind of gender constructions of masculinity actually influence hormonal levels. So there was a fascinating study that looked at the recipients of this 10-year program for boys who are at risk of sort of developing antisocial behaviour, and so they had this 10-year intervention where they were taught sort of social and regulatory skills and emotional skills. And in adulthood, those men were brought into the lab together with sort of the control participants from that, and they were put in this situation where they were playing a game supposedly with someone who was just behaving like a very frustrating aggressor in the game. Sorry, asshole is one of the easiest way of saying it. And they were measuring how aggressive the participant was in response to that, and also measured their testosterone level. And what they found was that the men who had the benefit of this intervention, they responded less aggressively, and that less aggressive response seemed to be related to the fact that their testosterone level did not respond to that aggressive behaviour by their opponent. And the argument here is that just the subjective interpretation of, what's going on here, how much should I care about it, that kind of, to what extent that masculinity sort of required the taking slight or taking offence was actually influencing hormonal levels. So this is a situation where, we have these things that we call social constructions of gender, but they're actually influencing our biology. So it becomes difficult to, or meaningless to try and tease them apart. Now, is it the gender constructions or is it testosterone? Well, actually, it's the two working together.
Things are deeply intertwined.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, the gender characteristics that are often ascribed to women are often positive characteristics: caring, consultative, empathetic, whereas for men they're frequently pejorative characteristics: aggressive, overly competitive, and so forth. I think you've described this actually as a form of, in terms of women, these division of characteristics as a form of like benevolent sexism.
Well, it's not my term, but yeah.
Isn't it?
No, it's not. I'd love to take credit for it, but other social psychologists have sort of drawn this distinction between the benevolent sexism that puts women on a pedestal. Women are so kind, they're so caring, they're so nurturing. And if they're not, well, God, they're bitches. And that's the hostile sexism part of it. So it's positive, but it's creating an expectation that women will behave in that kind of way, and they better or else.
Well, the type of gender essentialism that you've been critiquing today does exist within feminist circles, doesn't it? Why do you think there is still within feminism, which is a movement dedicated to equality and to some extent critiquing gender roles, why do you think that this gender essentialism still hangs on within the feminist movement?
Yeah, look, it's been a really long tension, and I was really fascinated to discover that during the campaign for the vote for women, you know, some of the campaigners were putting their arguments in terms of, you know, we're people, women are people, and they should have the equal right to a political voice, just justice demands it. And that didn't always go down terribly well. It was a bit of a radical idea. And so other campaigners were sort of drawing on this sort of, well, women have these special, unique qualities, and we will temper men's sort of, you know, nasty, competitive, ruthless qualities with our own warmer ones, and we'll kind of value add to the political process. And we have our own sort of areas of special expertise, which are women, children, and families. And so, you know, they sort of felt obliged to make this sort of business case, so to speak, for women's votes. And I think we're still in that situation. So we're still in a situation where women feel obliged to say, look, this is what we can bring to the board, as opposed to we're equally talented, we're equal, why aren't we there?
Yeah. In the UK, there was a Conservative peer who backed Theresa May for the Prime Ministership, and that peer said, I think people feel that at a time of turmoil, a woman would be more practical and a bit less testosterone-driven in approach, more collaborative, more willing to listen to voices around the table, less likely to have an instantly aggressive approach to things. This was one of the justifications for Theresa May taking over in that hostile Brexit environment in the UK. I think in some ways that sums up the view that many people have actually about women in politics. But I'm interested, you've written about this so-called glass cliff phenomenon as well, which interests me, which is where the idea that women are well suited to cleaning up after the mess that's been created before them.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is actually work from originated the sort of original evidence for it came from Michelle Ryan and Alex Haslam, and they were interested. So somebody had sort of angrily claimed in the Times, I think it was, that look, when you put women in, you know, women on boards or women directors, you know, suddenly share prices start to plummet, so women are incompetent. And they went back and had a close look at the data and found that actually what was happening is that when companies were in trouble, they brought in the women, and they became quite interested in this. And so now this whole sort of research program into this glass cliff phenomenon is this idea that women are put, you know, when things go terribly wrong, you bring in the women, and sort of looking at the circumstances in which that's the case. And there does seem to be this idea that there are these ideas of the qualities that women have that mean exactly the kind of quote that you were saying, that they're sort of particularly well suited for those situations. And it doesn't take long to think about what the implications are of this for women leaders. I mean, sure, okay, they're getting a shot, but what kind of circumstances are they getting their opportunities to lead, as opposed to when things are going well and there's the country or the organisation is well placed to really build on that secure base and do amazing things. That's when we have the men, and when things go wrong, we have the women. So Michelle Ryan refers it to the glass cushion that men get to sit on in terms of when they get their leadership positions compared to men.
Well, there's countless examples of that actually in Australia of women, especially women premiers I can think of, taking over the job from men at a time when they're in a virtually unwinnable position. I'm speaking with Cordelia Fine at the Bendigo Writers' Festival. Cordelia is a psychologist and professor of history and philosophy of science at the University of Melbourne. It's interesting too how the explanations and debates have changed. I mean, so, for example, we tend not to say anymore that men are more innately capable than women in the workforce. The argument now seems to be that certain jobs are more suited to men. Women, it's often said, are less interested in certain jobs because their priorities and aptitudes lie elsewhere, in the home, looking after the kids and so on. So the arguments have changed a bit, but the outcome hasn't changed a great deal. And I think we saw a bit of that, didn't we, in that famous Google memo from last year. You might want to remind us about that.
Yeah, so this was a quite extraordinary episode. I think it was August last year. There was, a fairly junior engineer software engineer in Google who had written a 10-page memo saying, look, Google's trying very hard to increase gender and racial diversity. The memo didn't talk about ethnicity very much. It was mostly focused on gender. But this engineer had sort of read, scientific papers saying that there were more neurotic, meant that they would be less sort of able to cope with leadership positions, but less, and also just less interested in engineering careers. That the idea of trying to reach 50-50 in terms of representation was, not a good idea and potentially going to undermine the merit of the appointments. The memo was leaked externally, and it caused sort of one of those social media outrages. And the engineer ultimately was fired by Google. To this memo were incredibly polarised. So in some sense it was like, this is just sexist pseudoscience, and other people were saying, oh my goodness, this person, what kind of society are we in? He's been fired for speaking what is no more than the truth. So it was sort of it was an indication of, how polarised people's views are on this issue.
That it's still alive and well.
Yes, and that it's very much alive and well. Yeah.
I read about the well-known short film festival in Sydney, Tropfest, introducing blind judging to their film screenings. So they have a whole lot of films that get submitted every year, and a select number make the finals. And what I'd read was that 5% of the films that made it through to the finals were women's films. So in order to counter this, apparently, they removed all descriptors from the film that had any indication of the gender of the filmmaker, and then got, for subsequent film Tropfest awards, people to watch the films and then rank them to see who made it into the finals, and the number jumped to 50% female. I read this, and I just wondered whether this is, and whether you've got any thoughts more generally on this issue of unconscious bias. I don't expect you to comment necessarily on that instance that I quoted there, having not seen the actual statistics. But do you think this is a common issue in society at the moment, that we do see the demonstration of unconscious bias in a gender sense?
We all are in a particular society that has particular assumptions and a particular hierarchy around gender. And I think this, one of the interesting things, just to sort of link this briefly to the Google case, is that there's just this very natural assumption that the qualities that men have, or that we associate with men, are kind of more important and more valuable. And I think that this, for all of us, I'm sure the judges would have been quite appalled at that had happened. But I think what it speaks to in terms of the solutions is exactly like, to the extent that one can give up on the idea of trying to de-bias our minds, but do everything that we can to de-bias organisations and processes is really going to be a sort of much better direction to go in. Because I think we're optimistic if we think that we are able to sort of shed the effects of decades of living in a particular culture.
I'm interested in the response to your book from some of your colleagues. Larry Cale is a neurobiologist at the University of California, and he apparently likens men and women to very different kinds of car. A Volvo and a Corvette, I think is what he said. And I think he dubbed you and people like you anti-sex difference scientists. What's your response to people like Larry Cale? And I'm sure there are others who've critiqued your work as well in the same way.
Yeah, look, I think there's a very unfortunate sort of narrative here around criticism of this area of research, which is, this is political, this is ideological, this is sort of, head in the sand about the fact that there are biological differences. So the work that I've done, the work that my colleagues done, is always about, it's with this goal of looking, how are our assumptions about sex and gender, which may not be very closely examined, how are they influencing the research? How are they influencing the research questions that we ask, the methods that we use, the analyses that we do, how we interpret the data? And you can see, my book is actually a sort of testimony to the work of many, often women scientists, who have thought about this assumption, saying, I'm not sure that's I'm going to test that assumption. That doesn't seem right to me. I'm going to ask a different research question that hasn't been asked before, like what are the effects of competition for female reproductive success? It's actually about doing better science. It's not about denying the role of biology or sex. It's actually about trying to think more carefully about the science that we do in this area while recognising that it, of course, has important political implications.
I mean, that's quite a scathing criticism of the science that's been done in the past, or the examination of the experiments that have been done in the past, and I can't imagine that type of scathing criticism has gone down terribly well either.
No, science evolves. I mean, that's what it does. It's a process of self-improvement. So, and I think one of the really positive aspects of what I've been seeing over the past 5 years is that the kind of criticisms that I've made and that others who work in similar areas have made have actually become incorporated. They're not just sort of in the sidelines, griping in the sidelines. They're actually being discussed in mainstream neuroscience journals, science journals, and they're actually starting to influence, journal policies and so on and so forth. So while there is this sort of narrative on the side of this is just political, this is anti-sex differences or whatever, however you want to characterise it, I actually think that in the main, the scientific community is increasingly, nobody likes having their work criticised, myself included, but there is very positive openness to thinking about these sorts of issues and how the research is being done and interpreted in a more nuanced way. And there's sort of robust debate about it, which is fantastic. That's what science is all about. And I see that as a very positive thing. And in general, I see that kind of mainstreaming of this kind of criticism as an incredibly positive thing for science.
And in terms of social change, we talk today frequently about the need for greater diversity in the workforce. And you've pointed out how this language of diversity as it applies to women has replaced the old-fashioned civil rights language of equal opportunity. So we now talk about diversity rather than equal opportunity. It's now desirable, for example, to have more women in the corporate world, it's argued, as they bring to those positions their female characteristics, and that helps to balance out the male characteristics, and in turn this is good for business and good for profit. But here we are, aren't we, back again with those old essentialist gender roles, even if our motivation is a good one, getting more women into the corporate world. Can you talk to this a bit, the value in hiring more women and how it's based on this idea that women possess these characteristics that men don't, and why that language is important of equal opportunity versus diversity?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really fascinating one, and it does trouble me when the case for bringing women into leadership positions is, first of all, based on a sort of caricatures of what women and men are like, which are often, quite insulting to men. The idea that men are incapable of being collaborative or consultative is just, a bit offensive, frankly. And also it just doesn't represent what we know from decades of research about the fact that while there are average differences, there's a huge amount of overlap, and knowing that someone is a woman or a man does not really tell you much about what they're like. But I think the second problematic issue of it is that it's just coming back to this needing to sort of justify, how women will add value. We take it for granted that men deserve to have their place on the board table, but women are going to need to make a case. And the idea that we need to, be running regression analyses to show what percentage enhancement of profit to shareholders women are going to bring, while we're not requiring that of men's presence on the board table, is actually just entrenching the legitimacy of the status quo. But that's not to say that I don't think it matters whether there are women there. And I think actually this what we were talking before about science is a real case in point. I mean, I don't think that women scientists have a sort of special womanly way of doing science, but they do actually come from it's not coincidence that it has tended to be women, for example, who have challenged these assumptions, that have asked different kinds of research questions. Or if you think about the history of medicine, it was the introduction of women into the medical profession that actually, gave more attention to issues that were of concern in medicine. The push towards having women included and female bodies included in medical research, for example. So moving away from this idea of the male body as the norm. So it's not to say that women having women and women's sort of the experiences that women have had and their particular interests and concerns represented isn't important. But I don't think we need to fall back on this sort of inaccurate essentialist views of the sexes to make that case.
Fantastic. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone? We have our first question. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. All strength to you, Cordelia. What I call rigour, that winding back of assumptions. One of the things that I've often reflected on and worry about is the apparent continuous tendency to give women the responsibility for a whole pile of things. And you've described some of them. You know, we're meant to dress in the right way, not be in the wrong place, move in when the corporation's going downhill. And it's this continuous, unconscious, from my point of view, tendency to give women the responsibility of men and their behaviour, and also to save the world, if you like. Fascinated with what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, look, I think that's a wonderful point, and I think part of this sort of dialogue, you know, for example, about the women in the financial system, you know, that sort of let's put the responsibility on women to make sure that we don't sort of fulfil the financial system with highly risky financial products. You know, we can't expect men to worry about that, so let's let women do it. And I think it comes back to this sort of benevolent versus hostile sexism, that we kind of value women for taking that responsibility and caring and making sure everything goes all right, and that also creates an expectation that they will, and that then there's a double standard as to who is supposed to take responsibility for taking care of other people and for society, and sort of exempting men from that responsibility. So I think that's absolutely right. Some of the work that I've been doing with a colleague at Melbourne University, Nick Haslam, and a Danish researcher, Leah Skews, has been trying to explore the extent to which our underlying beliefs about the nature of differences between men and women, so the extent to which people do hold these men are from Mars, women are from Venus points of view, actually influence the way we respond to women who behave in counter-stereotypic ways. And we found that even in Denmark as well as in Australia, we found that if people who are sort of gender essentialists feel more moral outrage towards a power-seeking female politician. So I think it just goes to show that these scientific ideas actually do impact these sort of subtle moral judgments that we make about, you know, how men and women should be behaving. So yeah, thank you for that observation.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. So, what's the answer? Did you come up with any answers of why women aren't in those high corporate positions?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any one single answer to that. There's a book by Alice Eagley and Linda Carley called The Glass Labyrinth, which tries to get to the point that, you know, the glass ceiling isn't a very helpful metaphor, because it kind of implies that there's a sort of just a single path that women are sort of find it harder to reach, and they think that this metaphor of the glass labyrinth is a better one, because it's sort of, you know, there's all these little twists and turns and things can go wrong, or you can be slowed down in so many different ways, and that's why there's no magic bullet to the sort of answer of how we solve these issues. That is just, it is that kind of hard work and constant thinking about how things can improve and how things can get better. And I think part of that is actually paying more than lip service to the idea that we should embrace all kinds of characteristics. I always find it interesting that although, you know, we say that, you know, women have these special skills that men lack, it's still women being sent to confidence workshops as opposed to men being sent to humility workshops, even though the very first bias that you teach at when I teach at the Melbourne Business School, the very first bias I teach is overconfidence bias, because it's such a key one for things going horribly wrong, and yet it's the sort of we still have this kind of fix the women mentality.
And that's where we'll have to leave Cordelia Fine. Cordelia is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Melbourne. Her most recent book is titled Testosterone Rex. As always, publication details can be found on the Big Ideas homepage. Thanks to the Bendigo Writers Festival. That's it for this Big Ideas. I'm Paul Barclay. If you like what you've heard, remember you can rate us on iTunes or your favourite podcast app. It really does help. If you're listening on the radio, You're tuned to RN. Until next time, bye for now.